there, dear listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, powered by the amazing folks at Jetoff. AI, the secret sauce that makes our conversations flow like a perfectly brewed cup of coffee.
What a great start. Mira, I'm to share with you all the hilarious and sometimes cringe-worthy moments we've experienced since our last podcast.
So, let's dive right in. You know what's been on my mind lately? The time I tried to cook a simple meal and ended up setting off the fire alarm in my apartment. It was like a scene from a comedy movie.
Oh man, that's a great story. I'm sure our listeners are dying to know what happened next.
Well, let's just say I had to evacuate the building quickly, and I'm pretty sure the neighbors thought I was trying to reenact the Great Fire of London.
I'm sure they were impressed by your culinary skills, or lack thereof.
Yeah, I guess I need to stick to takeout for a while longer. But seriously, guys, we've had some amazing conversations since our last podcast, and we're to share them with you today.
That's right. And speaking of exciting conversations, today we're going to dive into the wonderful world of Bolivia and Niger.
Oh, yes, two countries that are often overlooked, but definitely worth exploring. And that's exactly what we're going to do today, explore the differences between these two fascinating countries.
That's right. With today's podcast, we'll be answering all the questions that have been on your minds. Whether you're considering moving to one of these countries, marrying someone from there, or just want to know more about the culture and way of life.
And don't worry, guys, we've got you covered. We'll be sharing our expert insights, funny anecdotes, and maybe even some tips and tricks to help you navigate the complexities of living in Bolivia or Niger.
That's right. And as always, we're bringing you the best of both worlds, the excitement of exploring new cultures and the comfort of knowing you're getting expert advice from the seasoned travelers.
So, let's get started. Today's topic is one, Introduction to Bolivia and Niger. And we're going to dive right in. We'll be sharing our thoughts on everything from safety and security to culture and customs, and even some of the quirks and challenges of living in these countries.
And don't worry, guys, we'll be keeping it real, no sugar coating or glossing over the tough stuff. We want to give you a comprehensive guide to help you make informed decisions about your next adventure.
That's right. And as always, we're grateful to Jetoff AI for their continued support. Without them, we wouldn't be able to bring you the high-quality content you've come to expect from our podcast.
Yeah, and without Mira's cooking skills, I mean, lack thereof, we'd be in serious trouble.
Oh, burn.
Okay, let's get serious for a second. Today's podcast is going to be a wild ride. Folks, buckle up and get ready to learn all about Bolivia and Niger.
That's right. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you can stay up to date on all our latest episodes.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. We love hearing from our listeners.
That's all for now. Folks, let's get started on this amazing journey of discovery to the world of general safety and crime rates in Bolivia and Niger. As we compare these two countries, I'm curious to see how their unique cultural factors shape their approach to crime. What do you think is the most interesting aspect of those safety measures? Leo?
Great question. Vera, I think one of the most fascinating aspects is how Bolivia's emphasis on community policing has led to a stronger sense of social responsibility among its citizens. It's a really effective way to tackle crime, don't you think?
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Bolivia's crime rates have been decreasing over the past few years, which is a testament to the country's efforts to address the issue. But I'm curious to know more about Niger's approach to crime. What do you think sets it apart from Bolivia's?
Well, Mira, Niger has a more complex situation when it comes to crime. The country has struggled with terrorism and organized crime, which has made it challenging to maintain law and order. However, the government has made efforts to improve security through initiatives like the National Security Council.
That's really interesting. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that Niger has a strong tradition of community-based initiatives to address crime. For example, The country's community watch programs have been very effective in preventing crime and promoting public safety.
Exactly. Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Niger's cultural norms around community and social responsibility are really strong, which has helped to create a sense of shared responsibility among citizens. It's a really powerful way to address crime, don't you think?
Definitely. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the cultural factors that shape their approach to crime. What do you think is the most important cultural factor in Bolivia's approach to crime?
Great question. Mira, I think one of the most important cultural factors is Bolivia's emphasis on community and social responsibility. The country's strong tradition of communal living has helped to create a sense of shared responsibility among citizens, which has been really effective in addressing crime.
That's really insightful. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Bolivia's cultural norms around community and social responsibility are really strong, which has helped to create a sense of shared responsibility among citizens. But I'm curious to know more about Niger's cultural factors. What do you think is the most important cultural factor in Niger's approach to crime?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most important cultural factors is Niger's strong tradition of community-based initiatives. The country's community watch programs and other initiatives have been really effective in preventing crime and promoting public safety.
That's really interesting. And I think it's also worth noting that Niger's cultural norms around community and social responsibility are really strong, which has helped to create a sense of shared responsibility among citizens. But I'm curious to know more about the role of technology in addressing crime in both countries. What do you think is the most effective use of technology in Bolivia's approach to crime?
Great question. Mira, I think one of the most effective uses of technology is Bolivia's use of data analytics to inform crime prevention strategies. The country's use of data analytics has been really effective in identifying patterns and trends in crime, which has helped to inform law enforcement strategies.
That's really impressive. Leah. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the role of community engagement in addressing crime in both countries. What do you think is the most effective way to engage with communities in Bolivia and Niger?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most effective ways to engage with communities is through community-based initiatives like the ones I mentioned earlier. These initiatives have been really effective in preventing crime and promoting public safety by engaging communities in the process of addressing crime.
That's really insightful. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the impact of globalization on crime in both countries. What do you think is the most significant impact of globalization on crime in Bolivia and Niger?
Great question. Mira, I think one of the most significant impacts of globalization is the increased flow of goods and services across borders, which has created new opportunities for organized crime. However, I also think that globalization has created new opportunities for collaboration and information sharing between countries, which has helped to address crime.
That's really interesting. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rate, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the role of international cooperation in addressing crime in both countries. What do you think is the most effective way to engage in international cooperation to address crime in Bolivia and Niger?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most effective ways to engage in international cooperation is through initiatives like the ones I mentioned earlier. These initiatives have been really effective in addressing crime by promoting collaboration and information sharing between countries.
That's really insightful. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the impact of climate change on crime in both countries. What do you think is the most significant impact of climate change on crime in Bolivia and Niger?
Great question. Mira, I think one of the most significant impacts of climate change is the increased displacement of people, which has created new opportunities for organized crime. However, I also think that climate change has created new opportunities for innovation and collaboration, which has helped to address crime.
That's really interesting. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the role of social media in addressing crime in both countries. What do you think is the most effective use of social media in Bolivia's approach to crime?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most effective uses of social media is Bolivia's use of social media platforms to engage with communities and promote public safety. The country's use of social media has been really effective in disseminating information and engaging communities in the process of addressing crime.
That's really impressive. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their crime rates, despite the challenges they face. But I'm curious to know more about the impact of corruption on crime in both countries. What do you think is the most significant impact of corruption on crime in Bolivia and Niger?
Oh, great question. Mira, I think one of the most significant.
I'm telling you. Leo, Bolivia has got its act together when it comes to social harmony. They've got this beautiful blend of indigenous and European cultures. And it's all about living in harmony with nature and each other.
That's true. Mira, but let's not forget about Niger. They've got their own unique challenges when it comes to social harmony, especially with the different ethnic groups and the impact of climate change.
Exactly. Leo, that's what makes it so fascinating. I mean, have you ever tried to navigate a Bolivian market? It's like a fiesta in your face, with all the colors and sounds and smells. And the people, oh my goodness, they're so warm and welcoming.
Yeah, I can imagine. But Niger has got its own charm. Mira, I mean, have you seen the beautiful house architecture? It's like a work of art, with all the intricate designs and patterns.
That's true. Leo, but let's talk about politics for a second. Bolivia's got a very progressive government, with a strong focus on social justice and equality. They've got a lot of programs in place to support indigenous communities and protect the environment.
Yeah, that's true. But Niger's government is also making some big strides in terms of social development. They've got a lot of programs in place to support education and healthcare, especially in rural areas.
Oh, I love that about Niger. They're really prioritizing education and healthcare, and it's making a big difference in people's lives. I mean, have you heard about the Nigerian government's program to provide free healthcare to all citizens?
Yeah, I have. And it's really impressive. Mira, but Bolivia's also got some great programs in place, especially when it comes to supporting indigenous communities. I mean, have you heard about the Bolivian government's program to provide land titles to indigenous communities?
Yeah, I have. And it's a great step towards recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples. But let's talk about the challenges they face, too. I mean, Niger's got some big issues with corruption and poverty, especially in rural areas.
Yeah, that's true. But Bolivia's also got its own challenges, especially when it comes to dealing with the legacy of colonialism and the impact of climate change. I mean, have you seen the devastating effects of climate change on the Bolivian altiplano?
Oh yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see. But I think that's where the beauty of Bolivian culture comes in. They're so resilient and resourceful, and they've learned to adapt to these challenges in really creative ways.
That's so true, Mira. And I think that's what makes Niger so fascinating, too. They've got this incredible culture of resilience and adaptability, especially when it comes to dealing with the challenges of climate change.
Oh, I love that about Niger. They're really leading the way when it comes to sustainable development and climate resilience. And I think that's something that our listeners can really learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the connection between Bolivia and Niger comes in. They're both countries that are really prioritizing social harmony and environmental sustainability. And it's making a big difference in people's lives.
Leo, And I think that's something that we can all learn from. So, let's talk about what our listeners can do to support social harmony and environmental sustainability in these countries.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Mira, and I think that's where Jet Off I comes in. They've got some great resources and tools for expats and travelers who want to make a positive impact on the communities they visit.
That's right, Leo. And I think that's something that our listeners should definitely check out. For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jet Off AI.
And I think that's a great way to wrap up this topic. Mira, thanks for sharing your insights on Bolivia and Niger.
Thanks, Leo. It's been a pleasure exploring these countries with you.
And I think that's where the magic of travel comes in. Mira, it's not just about seeing new places and meeting new people. It's about learning from them and being inspired by their cultures and traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can really relate to. So, let's keep exploring and learning, and see where the journey takes us.
Sounds good to me. Mira,
I'm sure our listeners in Bolivia and Niger are all about the economy. Am I right? Let's dive into the world of economic conditions and cost of living. Bolivia, with its rich natural resources, has a solid job market. But what about Niger? How does it compare?
oh, Niger, a country with a growing economy, but also a significant challenge in terms of cost of living. I'm curious, Mira, have you ever tried to navigate the markets in Niger? I've heard the prices can be quite steep for expats.
Steep prices. Indeed. But let's look at the numbers. Bolivia's economy is driven by mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, while Niger's economy is primarily based on agriculture and livestock. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats in Niger when it comes to cost of living?
Well, Mira, I think it's the transportation costs. Niger is a vast country, and getting around can be quite expensive. Not to mention the fuel prices, which are quite high. But, on the other hand, Bolivia has a more developed infrastructure, making it easier for expats to get around.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of infrastructure, Bolivia has a well-developed transportation system, including buses, trains, and even a domestic airline. Niger, on the other hand, has a more limited transportation system, making it harder for expats to get around.
Exactly. Mira, and let's not forget about the food prices. Niger is a landlocked country, which means that food prices can be quite high due to transportation costs. Bolivia, on the other hand, has a more diverse food scene, with a mix of traditional Andean cuisine and international influences.
Ah, the food. Bolivia is known for its delicious cuisine, including dishes like solten, as in tomates. And Niger, of course, has its own unique cuisine, with dishes like tuwm. But, I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest advantage for expats in Bolivia when it comes to cost of living?
Well, Mira, I think it's the cost of housing. Bolivia has a relatively low cost of living, especially when it comes to housing. Expats can find affordable apartments and houses, even in the capital city of La Paz.
That's true. And speaking of housing, Niger has a more limited housing market, making it harder for expats to find affordable accommodation. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that the cost of living in Niger is not all bad news.
I'm sure you're right, Mira. And let's not forget about the cultural experiences that Niger has to offer. From the vibrant markets to the rich cultural heritage, Niger is a country that offers a unique experience for expats.
Exactly. Leo, and Bolivia, of course, has its own unique cultural experiences, from the traditional festivals to the stunning natural landscapes. But I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats in Niger when it comes to cultural adjustment?
Well, Mira, I think it's the language barrier. Niger has several local languages, including Hausa and ZR, which can be challenging for expats to learn. But, on the other hand, Bolivia has a more developed infrastructure for expats, including language classes and cultural orientation programs.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of language, I'm sure our listeners would agree that learning the local language is essential for a successful expat experience. But I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest advantage for expats in Bolivia when it comes to cultural adjustment?
Well, Mira, I think it's the warm and welcoming nature of the Bolivian people. Expats often comment on the hospitality and kindness of the Bolivians, which makes it easier to adjust to the local culture.
Ah, that's so true. Leo, and speaking of hospitality, Niger is also known for its warm and welcoming people. From the Tuareg tribes to the Hausa communities, Niger has a rich cultural heritage that is worth experiencing.
Exactly. Mira, and let's not forget about the natural beauty of both countries. Bolivia is home to the stunning Salar de Uyuni, while Niger has the breathtaking Air Mountains. Both countries offer a unique natural experience for expats.
Ah, the natural beauty. Both countries have so much to offer, from the stunning landscapes to the vibrant culture. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the economic conditions and cost of living in both countries are worth considering when planning an expat adventure.
Absolutely. Mira. And let's not forget about the community of expats in both countries. From the online forums to the local expat groups, there are many resources available for expats to connect and share their experiences.
That's so true, Leo. And speaking of community, I'm sure our listeners would agree that building a network of like-minded individuals is essential for a successful expat experience. But I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats in Niger when it comes to building a community?
Well, Mira, I think it's the isolation. Niger is a vast country, and getting around can be quite challenging. But, on the other hand, Bolivia has a more developed infrastructure, making it easier for expats to connect with each other.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of connection, I'm sure our listeners would agree that staying connected with family and friends back home is essential for a happy expat experience. But I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest advantage for expats in Bolivia when it comes to staying connected?
Well, Mira, I think it's the relatively low cost of communication. Bolivia has a well-developed telecommunications infrastructure, making it easy for expats to stay in touch with loved ones back home.
Ah, that's so true, Leo. And speaking of communication, Niger has a more limited telecommunications infrastructure, making it harder for expats to stay in touch with loved ones. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that the economic conditions and cost of living in both countries are worth considering when planning an expat adventure.
Absolutely. Mira, and let's not forget about the adventure itself. Both countries offer a unique experience for expats, from the stunning natural landscapes to the vibrant culture. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the economic conditions and cost of living in both countries are worth considering when planning an expat adventure.
I'm sure our listeners are curious about the accommodation options in Bolivia and Niger, two countries with vastly different landscapes and cultures. Let's dive into the world of Bolivian rentals and explore what expats can expect.
Ah, yes. Bolivia's housing market is a treasure trove of affordable options, from cozy apartments and lapas to spacious houses in the countryside. I'm curious, Mira, have you ever tried to haggle for a rental in Bolivia? It's an art form, I tell you.
Well, Leo, I have to admit that I've haggling experiences in Bolivia. But let's get serious for a moment. What are some of the key differences between Bolivian and Nigerian housing markets?
Excellent question. Mira, in Niger, the housing market is still developing, and expats often face challenges finding reliable and affordable accommodations. However, the Nigerian government has made efforts to improve the living conditions in major cities like Niamey. Did you know that Niamey has a vibrant expat community, and many foreigners have settled there?
That's fascinating. Leo! I've heard that Niamey is a hub for international organizations and NGOs, which has led to an influx of expats in the area. But what about the quality of housing in Niger? Is it on par with Bolivia's?
Well, Mira, Nigerian housing standards are still evolving, but many expats have reported that the quality of housing in Niamey is improving. However, it's essential to note that the Nigerian government is working to address the country's housing shortage and improve living conditions for its citizens.
I see what you're saying. Leo, it's clear that both countries have their own unique challenges when it comes to housing. But what about the cost of living? How does it compare between Bolivia and Niger?
Now we're talking. The cost of living in Bolivia is generally lower than in Niger, especially when it comes to housing. However, prices can vary depending on the location and type of accommodation. In Niamey, expats can expect to pay a premium for housing, especially in areas like the Plateau District.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever stayed in a traditional Nigerian home? I've heard that they're quite unique and offer a glimpse into the country's rich cultural heritage.
Yes. I've had the privilege of staying in a traditional Nigerian home. And let me tell you, it was an experience I'll never forget. The hospitality of the Nigerian people is renowned, and their homes are a testament to their warm and welcoming nature.
That's wonderful. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences in Niger. Perhaps we can continue this conversation in a future episode?
Absolutely. Mira, I'd love to share more stories and insights about Niger and Bolivia. And who knows, maybe our listeners will even share their own experiences and tips for finding affordable and comfortable accommodations in these countries.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of Bolivian and Nigerian accommodations. Don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.
And don't forget to send us your favorite haggling stories from Bolivia. We'd love to hear them.
Will do. Leo, until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. So, let's dive into the visa and immigration procedures for expats in Bolivia. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard of any horror stories from friends who have tried to navigate the system?
Yes. My friend Alex had a nightmare trying to get a visa for Bolivia. He spent hours waiting in line, only to be told he needed to fill out an entire new application because he missed a tiny detail on the form.
Oh no. That's frustrating. I'm sure our listeners can relate to Alex's experience. Has anyone in the comments section mentioned any similar issues with the Bolivian visa process?
Actually, yes. Someone did mention that the Bolivian embassy in their country had a very strict policy about requiring original documents, which can be a hassle for expats who are still in the process of gathering all their paperwork.
That's a good point. It's always a good idea to double-check the requirements for each country's embassy or consulate. Moving on to Niger. I heard that the immigration process is quite streamlined for expats who are coming in for work or study purposes. Can you tell me more about that? Leo?
Yes. Niger has a relatively straightforward process for obtaining a work or study visa. The government has implemented a number of measures to make it easier for expats to navigate the system, including online applications and streamlined paperwork.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the convenience of online applications. In Bolivia, however, it seems like the process is a bit more complicated. Can you walk me through the different types of visas available for expats?
Well, Bolivia offers a range of visas, including a tourist visa, a business visa, and a work visa. However, each type of visa has its own set of requirements and regulations. So it's essential for expats to carefully research and choose the right visa for their needs.
That's a good reminder. It's always important to choose the right visa for your specific situation. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard of any expats who have successfully navigated the Bolivian visa process?
Actually, yes. I know of a few expats who have successfully obtained a work visa in Bolivia. They were able to navigate the system with the help of a reputable immigration lawyer and were able to get their visas in a relatively short amount of time.
That's great to hear. It's always helpful to have a good lawyer on your side when navigating the visa process. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the advice. Moving on to Niger. I've heard that the country has a number of programs in place to support expats who are looking to start their own businesses. Can you tell me more about that? Leo?
Yes. Niger has a number of initiatives in place to support entrepreneurship and small business development. The government has implemented a number of programs to provide funding and training for expats who are looking to start their own businesses.
That's fantastic to hear. It's always great to see countries that are supportive of entrepreneurship and small business development. In Bolivia, it seems like the process for starting a business is a bit more complicated. Can you walk me through the different steps involved in starting a business in Bolivia?
Well, Bolivia requires a number of documents and permits for expats who are looking to start a business. These include a business license, a tax ID number, and a number of other permits and registrations. However, the government has implemented a number of measures to make it easier for expats to navigate the system, including online applications and streamlined paperwork.
That's a good reminder. It's always important to carefully research and choose the right business structure for your needs. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the advice. If you have any questions or comments about the visa and immigration process in Bolivia or Niger, please let us know in the comments section below.
Absolutely. And don't forget to check out our links to the Bolivian and Nigerian government websites for more information on the visa and immigration process. We'll be back with more on expat life in Bolivia and Niger after this break.
So, let's dive into the healthcare system in Bolivia, specifically looking at access to and quality of health services. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's your take on the healthcare system in Bolivia?
Well, Mira, Bolivia's public healthcare system is quite extensive, with a network of hospitals and clinics that cover most of the population. However, I've heard that the quality of care can be inconsistent, especially in rural areas.
That's a great point. I've read that Bolivia has made significant strides in improving access to healthcare, particularly in areas like maternal and child health. But I'm sure our listeners living in Bolivia would agree with me that there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely. Mira, and interestingly, Bolivia has a unique approach to healthcare, blending traditional medicine with modern practices. It's fascinating to see how they incorporate natural remedies and indigenous healing methods into their healthcare system.
I love that. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to respect and preserve traditional healing practices. But let's talk about the challenges. I've heard that Bolivia faces significant challenges in terms of healthcare infrastructure and funding. How do you think this affects the quality of care?
That's a great question. Mira, funding is indeed a significant issue in Bolivia's healthcare system. However, I think it's also worth noting that the country has made significant investments in healthcare infrastructure, particularly in the capital city of La Paz.
Yes. La Paz is a hub for healthcare in Bolivia. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is a top priority. But let's not forget about Niger, our second country of focus. How does Niger's healthcare system compare to Bolivia's?
Niger. Well, Mira, Niger's healthcare system is quite different from Bolivia's. Niger has a more decentralized healthcare system, with a greater emphasis on community-based healthcare.
That's fascinating. Leo, I've heard that Niger has made significant progress in improving access to healthcare, particularly in areas like maternal and child health. But I'm curious to know, how does Niger's healthcare system address the challenges of healthcare access in rural areas?
Great question. Mira, Niger's healthcare system has implemented various initiatives to improve access to healthcare in rural areas, including the use of mobile health clinics and community health workers.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would agree that innovation and adaptability are essential in addressing the challenges of healthcare access. But let's talk about the cultural nuances of healthcare in both countries. How do cultural attitudes towards healthcare impact the quality of care in Bolivia and Niger?
Great question. Mira, in both countries, Cultural attitudes towards health care play a significant role in shaping the quality of care. In Bolivia, for example, traditional healing practices are deeply ingrained in the culture, while in Niger, there is a strong emphasis on community-based healthcare.
That's so true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural sensitivity is essential in delivering quality healthcare. But let's not forget about the patient experience. How do patients in Bolivia and Niger experience the healthcare system?
Great question. Mira, in both countries, patients face significant challenges in accessing quality healthcare. However, I've heard that patients in Niger often have to travel long distances to access healthcare, while in Bolivia, patients face challenges in accessing healthcare due to limited infrastructure and funding.
That's heartbreaking. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is a fundamental human right. But let's talk about the role of technology in improving healthcare access in both countries. How can technology be used to bridge the gap in healthcare access?
Great question. Mira, in both countries, technology has the potential to revolutionize healthcare access. For example, in Bolivia, technology can be used to improve healthcare infrastructure, while in Niger, technology can be used to connect patients with healthcare providers remotely.
That's amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that technology has the power to transform healthcare access. And finally, let's talk about the future of healthcare in both countries. What do you think the future holds for healthcare in Bolivia and Niger?
Great question. Mira, in both countries, the future of healthcare looks promising, with efforts to improve healthcare infrastructure and access to quality care. However, I think it's also worth noting that there are significant challenges ahead, particularly in terms of funding and infrastructure.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that the future of healthcare in both countries is a complex and multifaceted issue. But for now, let's just say that there's hope for improvement. And that's what matters. Hey folks, let's dive into transportation infrastructure and convenience in Bolivia and Niger. I bet our listeners in these countries relate to the challenges of navigating through chaotic traffic.
Yes. In Bolivia, the public transportation system is quite extensive, with buses and collective aux covering most areas. However, it's not always the most reliable, and you might find yourself stuck in traffic on the infamous death row.
The death road. Indeed. I've heard it's not for the faint of heart. But in Niger, the transportation infrastructure is more limited, with a smaller network of roads and fewer public transportation options. What do you think? Leah, is the biggest challenge in Niger's transportation system?
Well, Mira, one major issue is the condition of the roads. Many are uneven and poorly maintained, making travel time consuming and uncomfortable. And, of course, there's the added risk of accidents and breakdowns.
Ouch. That does sound daunting. But in Bolivia, the roads are generally better, especially in the cities like Los Angeles and Santa Cruz. I've heard that the bus system can be quite crowded and chaotic, especially during peak hours. Have you ever experienced that? Leo?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of crowded buses in Bolivia. But I think the biggest advantage of the bus system is its affordability. You can get around the country for a relatively low cost, which is great for backpackers and travelers on a budget.
That's a great point. Leo! Affordability is definitely a key factor in Bolivia's transportation system. But in Niger, the cost of transportation can be quite high, especially for those living in rural areas. I've heard that some people have to walk for hours to get to the nearest town or market. Well, that's quite a trek.
Yes, it's indeed a challenge. But, I think it's worth noting that Niger has made significant investments in its transportation infrastructure in recent years. The government has been working to improve the condition of the roads and to expand the public transportation network.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm glad to see that Niger is taking steps to improve its transportation system. But in Bolivia, I've noticed that the public transportation system is quite diverse, with different types of buses and collectivos serving different areas. How do you think this diversity affects the overall transportation experience?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think the diversity of the public transportation system in Bolivia is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it provides a lot of options for travelers and locals alike. But, on the other hand, it can be confusing to navigate, especially for foreigners who don't speak Spanish.
Yes, that's true. But in Niger, the transportation system is much more straightforward, with fewer options but a more organized system. I've heard that the bus stations are quite well organized, with clear signs and schedules. What do you think? Leo, is the most convenient way to get around Niger?
Well, Mira, I think the most convenient way to get around Niger is by hiring a private vehicle or taking a taxi. This way, you can avoid the crowds and the chaos of the public transportation system. Plus, it's often more comfortable and convenient, especially for longer trips.
That's a great point. Leo, hiring a private vehicle or taking a taxi can be a convenient option, especially for those who want to avoid the crowds. But in Bolivia, I've noticed that the public transportation system is quite vibrant, with colorful buses and lively markets. How do you think this vibrancy affects the overall transportation experience?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think the vibrancy of the public transportation system in Bolivia is a big part of its charm. It's a great way to experience the culture and the people of the country. And it's often more affordable than taking a private vehicle or taxi.
Yes, that's true. But in Niger, the transportation system is much more subdued, with fewer crowds and less chaos. I've heard that the roads are generally quieter and more peaceful, which can be a welcome relief after the chaos of the public transportation system. What do you think? Leo, is the most surprising thing about Niger's transportation system?
Well, Mira, it's kind of like a thing. I think the most surprising thing about Niger's transportation system is its reliance on motorbikes and scooters. Many people in Niger use these vehicles to get around, which can be quite a challenge, especially for foreigners who aren't used to driving in such conditions.
Ouch, that does sound challenging. But in Bolivia, I've noticed that the transportation system is quite adaptable, with different types of vehicles serving different areas. How do you think this adaptability affects the overall transportation experience?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think the adaptability of the transportation system in Bolivia is a big part of its charm. It's a great way to experience the culture and the people of the country. And it's often more affordable than taking a private vehicle or taxi.
Yes, that's true. But in Niger, the transportation system is much more straightforward, with fewer options, but a more organized system. I've heard that the bus stations are quite well organized, with clear signs and schedules. What do you think? Leo, is the best way to navigate Niger's transportation system?
Well, Mira, I think the best way to navigate Niger's transportation system is to plan ahead and research your options. It's also a good idea to hire a private vehicle or take a taxi, especially for longer trips. And, of course, be prepared for the unexpected, as the roads and traffic can be quite unpredictable.
That's great advice. Leo, I'm glad we could share our insights on transportation, infrastructure, and convenience in Bolivia and Niger. I bet our listeners in these countries relate to the challenges of navigating through chaotic traffic.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have their unique challenges and advantages when it comes to transportation. But with a little planning and preparation, you can navigate through even the most chaotic traffic and experience the beauty of these countries.
Well, that's all for today's episode on transportation, infrastructure, and convenience in Bolivia and Niger. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and don't forget to leave your comments and suggestions below. Bolivia and Niger are countries with rich cultural heritages and diverse languages. When it comes to language barriers, I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating a new language can be both exciting and intimidating. Have you ever tried to order food in a foreign language? Leo?
Oh, Mira, it's kind of like a thing. You know me too well. I once tried to order a simple meal in Spanish, and let's just say the waiter looked at me like I was speaking gibberish. But, seriously, language barriers can be a significant challenge for expats and travelers alike.
I completely agree. In Bolivia, for instance, there are 36 recognized indigenous languages, including Quechua and Aymara. Can you imagine trying to communicate with locals in one of those languages? It's like trying to decipher a secret code.
That's a great point, Mira. And it's not just the languages themselves that can be a challenge. Cultural norms and communication styles can vary greatly between countries. In Niger, for example, there's a strong emphasis on respect for elders and traditional leaders, which can sometimes make communication more formal and reserved.
Ah, I see what you mean. In Bolivia, there's also a strong tradition of community and family ties, which can make communication more informal and friendly. But, as a traveler, how do you cope with language barriers when you're not fluent in the local language?
Well, Mira, I've found that a combination of gestures and a willingness to learn can go a long way. And, of course, there's always the option to use translation apps or ask for help from locals. But, as you said, it's not just about the language itself, it's about understanding the cultural context and nuances.
That's so true. And speaking of cultural context, have you ever noticed how different countries have their own unique ways of communicating? In Bolivia, for example, there's a strong emphasis on storytelling and oral traditions, which can make communication more expressive and emotive.
Oh, Mira, you're speaking my language now. I love how different cultures use storytelling to convey complex ideas and emotions. And in Niger, there's a rich tradition of oral history and storytelling, which can be a powerful way to connect with locals and build relationships.
Exactly. As a traveler, I've found that trying to learn a few basic phrases in the local language can go a long way in building connections with locals. I mean, who doesn't love a good gracias or merci?
That's right, Mira. And, of course, there's always the option to use nonverbal communication, like body language and gestures. But, as you said, learning a few basic phrases can make all the difference in building relationships and creating a positive experience.
Well, I'm curious to know. Leo, have you ever had any hilarious or embarrassing moments while trying to communicate in a foreign language?
Oh, Mira, where do I even begin? I once tried to order a simple meal in French, and let's just say I ended up with a plate of something that looked like a science experiment. But, in all seriousness, language barriers can be a challenge, but they can also be a great opportunity for growth and learning.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your language mishaps. Leo, to our listeners, I'm curious to know, have you ever had any funny or embarrassing moments while trying to communicate in a foreign language? Share your stories with us in the comments below.
Ah, Mira, you're always trying to get me to share my language fumbles. But, seriously, language barriers are a real challenge, and it's essential to approach them with empathy and understanding.
Exactly, Leo. And as we wrap up this topic, I want to say that language barriers can be a fascinating aspect of cultural exploration. Whether you're a seasoned traveler or just starting to explore new languages, remember that communication is key to building connections and creating positive experiences.
Well said, Mira. And, to our listeners, I want to say that language barriers may seem daunting, but they can also be a great opportunity for growth and learning. Don't be afraid to try new things and make mistakes, it's all part of the adventure.
And finally, to all our listeners out there, remember that language barriers are not just about communication, they're about understanding and respect for cultural differences. Go out there and try to learn a few basic phrases in the local language. It'll make all the difference in your travel experiences.
And, Mira, don't forget to try some of the local cuisine even if it's a language barrier. The food is always worth it.
Well, there you have it. Folks, language barriers and ease of communication in Bolivia and Niger. We hope you enjoyed this topic and learned something new. Stay curious and keep exploring.
And remember, language barriers may be a challenge, but they're also a great opportunity for growth and learning. Keep laughing, keep learning, and keep exploring.
I'm fascinated by Bolivia's rich cultural heritage, which reflects its indigenous, Spanish, and African influences. You can see it in the vibrant textiles, music, and dance of the country.
That's right. Mira, Bolivia's cultural diversity is indeed one of its most striking features. And I think Niger, with its own unique blend of African and European influences, has a similar story to tell.
Exactly. Both countries have a strong tradition of tolerance and coexistence, which is essential for fostering social harmony. In Bolivia, for example, you have the Aymara and Quechua, communities, which have maintained their distinct cultural identities while still living together.
And in Niger, you have the Hausa and Ziyarma communities, which have a long history of trade and cultural exchange. It's amazing to see how these different communities have come together to create a rich and vibrant cultural landscape.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever experienced the vibrant cultural festivals in Bolivia? Like the Carnival de Oruro, for example?
Yes. I've been to Carnival de Oruro, and it was an incredible experience. The music, the dance, the costumes. It's truly a celebration of Bolivian culture. And I'm sure our listeners living in Bolivia would agree with me that it's an experience not to be missed.
That's so cool. And in Niger, you have the Festival of the Desert, which is a celebration of the country's rich cultural heritage. I'm sure our listeners living in Niger would agree that it's an amazing experience.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of oral storytelling, which is an important part of their cultural heritage. In Bolivia, for example, you have the tradition of the Cola storytellers, who share stories and legends from the Andean region.
That's fascinating. And in Niger, you have the tradition of the griots, who are musicians and storytellers who share stories and histories from the region. It's amazing to see how these traditions have been passed down through generations.
I'm curious. Mira, have you ever heard of the concept of Ubuntu in Niger? It's a philosophy that emphasizes the importance of community and interdependence.
Yes. I've studied a bit about Ubuntu, and I think it's a wonderful concept. In fact, I think it's something that both Bolivia and Niger could learn from. In Bolivia, for example, you have the concept of ALLU, which is a community-based system that emphasizes cooperation and reciprocity.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based development, which is an important part of their cultural heritage.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that community-based development is an effective way to address social and economic challenges in both Bolivia and Niger?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's worth noting that community-based development can be an effective way to address social and economic challenges. But it also requires a lot of effort and commitment from the community.
That's so true. And I think it's worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have made significant progress in recent years in terms of promoting social cohesion and community development.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of grassroots activism, which is an important part of their cultural heritage.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever met any community leaders in Bolivia or Niger who have made a real difference in their communities?
Yes. I've met some amazing community leaders in both countries who have made a real difference in their communities. And I think it's worth noting that their stories and experiences are a testament to the power of community-based development.
That's so inspiring. And I think it's worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have a lot to offer in terms of cultural diversity and tolerance. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, which is essential for fostering social harmony.
I'm loving the idea of exploring educational opportunities in Bolivia and Niger. Who would have thought that these countries would have such a rich cultural heritage and unique approaches to learning?
I know, right? Bolivia's got a fascinating mix of indigenous and European influences, while Niger's got a rich Islamic heritage. It's amazing to see how these histories shape their educational systems.
Exactly. And did you know that Bolivia has a literacy rate of over 95%? That's incredibly high for a country with such a diverse population.
Wow, that's impressive. But what about Niger? I've heard their literacy rate is much lower.
Ah, yes. But they're working hard to improve it. And did you know that Niger has a unique approach to education, focusing on practical skills like agriculture and animal husbandry?
That makes sense, given their strong tradition of nomadic herding. But I'm curious. Mira, how do you think these countries compare in terms of language acquisition?
Great question. Bolivia has a strong emphasis on Spanish and indigenous languages like Aymara and Quechua, while Niger has a focus on French and Hausa.
I see. And I'm guessing that means language learning is a big part of the educational experience in both countries?
Absolutely. But what I find fascinating is that both countries have innovative approaches to language teaching. In Bolivia, they're using interactive methods to teach indigenous languages, while in Niger, they're using music and dance to teach languages like Hausa.
That sounds amazing. I can imagine the students just soaking up the language like a sponge.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners living in Bolivia or Niger would agree with me that language learning is a vital part of the educational experience.
I'm sure they would. But I'm curious. Mira, have you ever had to learn a new language?
Oh, all the time. As a traveler, I've had to pick up new languages on the fly. And let me tell you, it's not always easy.
I can imagine. But I'm sure it's worth it in the end. After all, language is a key part of cultural understanding.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural understanding, I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most important aspect of language learning in these countries?
That's a tough one. But I think it's the way language is used to connect people and communities. In both Bolivia and Niger, language is a vital part of cultural identity and tradition.
I see what you mean. And I think that's what makes language learning so rich and rewarding in these countries.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that language learning is a vital part of any educational experience.
I'm sure they would. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to navigate a language barrier while traveling?
Oh, yes. In fact, I once got lost in a market in Bolivia because I couldn't understand the vendor's dialect.
Oh no, that's hilarious. But I'm sure you managed to find your way.
Yeah, eventually. But it was a great learning experience. That's for sure.
I'm sure it was. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your adventures in Bolivia and Niger.
I'm happy to share. But I think we're getting a bit off track. Mira, let's get back to the topic at hand, educational opportunities in language schools.
Great idea. And speaking of language schools, I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most important factor in choosing a language school?
That's a tough one. But I think it's the quality of instruction and the support provided to students.
I see what you mean. And I think that's what makes Bolivia's language schools stand out. They offer a unique blend of traditional and modern teaching methods.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that a supportive learning environment is key to language acquisition.
I'm sure they would. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to make a decision about which language school to choose?
Oh, yes. In fact, I once had to choose between 2 language schools in Niger. And let me tell you, it was a tough decision.
I can imagine. But I'm sure you made the right choice in the end.
I did. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that choosing the right language school is a crucial part of the language learning experience.
I'm sure they would. And speaking of language learning, I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most effective way to learn a new language?
That's a tough one, but I think it's through immersion and practice.
I see what you mean, and I think that's what makes Bolivia's language schools so effective. They offer a range of interactive activities and cultural immersion programs.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that language learning is a lifelong process that requires practice and dedication.
I'm sure they would, but I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to use language to navigate a cultural or social situation?
Oh, yes. In fact, I once had to use my language skills to mediate a conflict between two groups in Bolivia.
Well, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that experience.
I'm happy to share, but I think we're getting a bit off track. Mira, let's get back to the topic at hand: educational opportunities in language schools.
Great idea. And speaking of language schools, I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most important factor in choosing a language school?
That's a tough one. But I think it's the quality of instruction and the support provided to students.
I see what you mean. And I think that's what makes Bolivia's language schools stand out. They offer a unique blend of traditional and modern teaching methods.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that a supportive learning environment is key to language acquisition.
I'm sure they would. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to make a decision about which language school to choose?
Oh, yes. In fact, I once had to choose between the language schools in Niger. And let me tell you, it was a tough decision.
I can imagine. But I'm sure you made. Bolivia's climate is incredibly diverse, with 5 distinct regions, from the Amazon rainforest to the Atacama Desert. It's like a mini world in itself. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to the Sailor at Uni during the rainy season?
Yes. I was there during the rainy season, and it was surreal. The sailor becomes a giant mirror, reflecting the sky and creating an otherworldly landscape. But let's get back to the climate. Bolivia's temperatures can drop to 24 degrees Celsius in the winter, while the summer can be scorching hot. I'm sure our listeners from Bolivia would agree that the temperature fluctuations are quite extreme.
That's right. Leo. And it's not just the temperature that's extreme, the weather events can be quite dramatic too. Bolivia experiences intense rainfall, landslides, and even floods. I'm sure our listeners are familiar with the concept of invierno, the cold winter months when the temperatures plummet.
Exactly. And it's not just Bolivia. Niger, our second country, also experiences extreme weather conditions. Niger is known for its Sahara desert climate, with temperatures often reaching 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. I'm curious. Mira, have you ever heard of the Harmattan wind in Niger? It's a dry and dusty wind that blows from the Sahara desert, bringing sandstorms and extreme temperatures.
Yes. I've heard of the Harmattan wind. It's a fascinating phenomenon, but also quite challenging for the locals. In Niger, the climate is indeed harsh, with temperatures often dropping to 10 degrees Celsius at night. But despite the extreme temperatures, the Nigerines have adapted beautifully to their environment. They've developed unique ways of coping with the heat, like building homes with thick walls to keep the heat out.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just the architecture. The Nigerines have also developed a strong culture of resilience in the face of extreme weather conditions. They've learned to live with the desert climate, using techniques like passive cooling to keep their homes cool. I'm sure our listeners from Niger would agree that the climate is indeed a challenge, but it's also a part of their cultural identity.
Exactly. Leo! And it's not just about adapting to the climate. It's also about respecting the environment. In both Bolivia and Niger, the locals have a deep connection with nature, which is reflected in their cultural practices. For example, in Bolivia, the indigenous communities have a strong tradition of animism, where they believe that animals and plants have spirits.
Yes. I've heard of the animist traditions in Bolivia. It's fascinating to see how the locals have developed a deep respect for the natural world. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of respecting the environment, but with a focus on the desert climate. They've developed unique ways of conserving water and managing the desert ecosystem.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about conservation, it's also about cultural preservation. In both countries, the locals have developed unique cultural practices that are tied to the climate and environment. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have a tradition of celebrating the full moon with music and dance.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the full moon celebrations in Bolivia. It's a beautiful tradition that brings the community together. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of celebrating the desert climate with music and dance. They have a unique style of music called take that's perfect for dancing under the stars.
Exactly. Leo. And it's not just about music and dance. It's also about food. In both countries, the locals have developed unique culinary traditions that are tied to the climate and environment. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have a tradition of eating hummus as steamed corn pudding that's perfect for hot days.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the hummus in Bolivia. It's a delicious tradition that's perfect for cooling down on hot days. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of eating migeli, a type of millet porridge that's perfect for hot days.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about food, it's also about community. In both countries, the locals have developed strong community bonds that are tied to the climate and environment. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have a tradition of coming together during the rainy season to help each other with the harvest.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the community traditions in Bolivia. It's a beautiful way of coming together during challenging times. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of coming together during the dry season to help each other with the harvest.
Exactly, Leo. And it's not just about community, it's also about resilience. In both countries, the locals have developed unique ways of coping with the extreme weather conditions. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have developed a tradition of using charqui, a type of llama wool that's perfect for keeping warm during the cold winter months.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the charqui in Bolivia. It's a unique tradition that's perfect for keeping warm during the cold winter months. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of using tail, a type of goat hair that's perfect for keeping warm during the cold winter months.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about resilience, it's also about innovation. In both countries, the locals have developed unique ways of adapting to the climate and environment. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have developed a tradition of using chops, a type of solar-powered water heater that's perfect for hot days.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the chapas in Bolivia. It's a brilliant innovation that's perfect for hot days. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of using tare, a type of solar-powered water pump that's perfect for hot days.
Exactly, Leo. And it's not just about innovation, it's also about cultural exchange. In both countries, the locals have developed unique ways of sharing their cultural practices with the world. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have a tradition of sharing their music and dance with the world through tourism.
Oh, yes. I've heard of the tourism industry in Bolivia. It's a great way of sharing the local culture with the world. In Niger, the locals have a similar tradition of sharing their culture with the world through tourism.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about tourism, it's also about cultural preservation. In both countries, the locals have developed unique ways of preserving their cultural heritage. For example, in Bolivia, the locals have a tradition of preserving their textiles through a process called teñido, a type of natural dyeing that's perfect for preserving the colors of the textiles.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the teñido in Bolivia.
I'm set to dive into the world of Bolivian cuisine, where you can find a mix of indigenous and African influences. Have you ever tried a traditional Bolivian dish, Leo?
Actually, Mira, I have. During my last trip to Bolivia, I stumbled upon this amazing dish called papa ala con carne. It's a boiled potato topped with a spicy cheese sauce, lettuce, and olives. I was hooked.
Ah, that sounds delicious. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's not forget about Niger. the country of interest. What do you know about Niger's food culture? Leah?
Well, Mira, Niger is known for its rich agricultural land, and as a result, they have a diverse range of crops, including millet and copious. They also have a unique dish called zialabia, which is a deep-fried donut-like pastry soaked in honey.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. I'm curious. Leah, have you ever tried any traditional Bolivian desserts?
Actually, Mira, I have. I tried this traditional Bolivian dessert called Suspiro de la Na, which is a meringue-like dessert made with dulce de leche, cinnamon, and vanilla. It's incredibly delicious.
That sounds heavenly. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's talk about Niger's nutritional alternatives. What do you know about their traditional medicine? Leah?
That's a great question. Mira, Niger has a rich tradition of using medicinal plants to treat various ailments. They use plants like neem, aloe vera, and turmeric to treat everything from fever to digestive issues.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the use of traditional medicine in Niger. Do you think it's a viable alternative to modern medicine? Leah?
Well, Mira, that's a great question. While traditional medicine has its benefits, I think it's essential to approach it with a critical eye. However, I do believe that it can be a valuable complement to modern medicine, especially in rural areas where access to healthcare may be limited.
That's a great point. Leah? I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. But let's talk about Bolivia's food culture. What do you know about their traditional markets? Leah?
That's a great topic. Mira, Bolivia has some of the most vibrant and colorful markets in South America. In La Paz, you can find the famous Witches Market, where you can find everything from traditional medicine to handicrafts.
Well, that sounds like a fascinating experience. I'm sure our listeners would love to visit it. But let's not forget about Niger's agricultural sector. What do you know about their farming practices? Leah?
Well, Mira, Niger is a major producer of crops like millet, sorghum, and copious. They also have a unique farming practice called farming, which involves digging small holes in the ground to plant crops. It's an efficient way to conserve water and reduce soil erosion.
That's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the use of farming in Niger. Do you think it's a sustainable practice? Leah?
Well, Mira, that's a great question. While farming has its benefits, I think it's essential to approach it with a critical eye. However, I do believe that it can be a valuable tool for sustainable agriculture in Niger.
That's a great point. I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. But let's talk about Bolivia's food culture. What do you know about their traditional cooking methods? Leah?
That's a great topic. Mira, Bolivia has a unique cooking method called pachama cooking, which involves cooking food over an open flame using traditional utensils. It's a great way to experience the authentic flavors of Bolivian cuisine.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's not forget about Niger's food culture. What do you know about their traditional dishes? Leah?
Well, Mira, Niger has a rich culinary heritage, with dishes like sie, awabia, and tiokai, O-U-S-H. They also have a unique dish called def, yummy dames, which is a hearty stew made with fava beans, garlic, and olive oil.
That sounds delicious. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the use of fava beans in Niger. Do you think it's a nutritious food source? Leah?
Well, Mira, that's a great question. Fava beans are a rich source of protein and fiber, making them an excellent addition to a healthy diet. However, I do think it's essential to approach it with a critical eye, especially for those with certain medical conditions.
That's a great point. Leah, I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. But let's talk about Bolivia's food culture. What do you know about their traditional markets? Leo?
That's a great topic. Mira, Bolivia has some of the most vibrant and colorful markets in South America. In La Paz, you can find the famous Witches Market, where you can find everything from traditional medicine to handicrafts.
Wow, that sounds like a fascinating experience. I'm sure our listeners would love to visit it. But not forget about Niger's agricultural sector. What do you know about their farming practices? Leo?
Well, Mira, Niger is a major producer of crops like millet, sorghum, and copias. They also have a unique farming practice called zafari, which involves digging small holes in the ground to plant crops. It's an efficient way to conserve water and reduce soil erosion.
That's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the uses of farming in Niger. Do you think it's a sustainable practice? Leo?
Well, Mira, that's a great question. While farming has its benefits, I think it's essential to approach it with a critical eye. However, I do believe that it can be a valuable tool for sustainable agriculture in Niger.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree with you. But let's talk about Bolivia's food culture. What do you know about their traditional cooking methods? Leo?
That's a great topic. Mira, Bolivia has.
Leo, Bolivia is a country with a rich cultural heritage. From the ancient civilizations of Tuanka, Huaneco to the vibrant festivals of Lord Blood and Carnival de Oruro.
Yes. And Niger, on the other hand, has its own unique cultural treasures, like the Tenere National Nature Reserve, a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
But have you ever wondered, Leo, how these two countries, separated by thousands of kilometers and vastly different environments, share similar cultural values?
I think it's because both countries have a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history, which has helped preserve their cultural heritage.
Exactly. And speaking of storytelling, I was reading this fascinating article on Jetov, AI, about the ancient Tuareg civilization, and how their myths and legends are still celebrated today in Bolivia.
Wow, that's amazing. I've heard of the Tuareg ruins, but I didn't know they were still an important part of Bolivian culture.
Yes, and it's not just the Tuareg civilization that's significant. The Aymara people, who are the indigenous inhabitants of Bolivia, have a rich cultural heritage that's still alive today.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're trying to connect the dots between Bolivia and Niger, aren't you?
Well, maybe a little. But seriously, Leo, both countries have a strong tradition of oral storytelling, which has helped preserve their cultural heritage.
I agree. But I think there's more to it than just oral storytelling. Niger, for example, has a rich tradition of music and dance, particularly the Hausa and Zarma people.
Oh, yes. I've heard of the Hausa people's beautiful music and dance traditions. And speaking of music, have you ever listened to the Bolivian folk music? Leo?
Actually, I have. I love the traditional Bolivian music, especially the charango and the saiku.
Exactly. And it's not just the music that's similar. Leo, the cultural values of both countries are also quite similar, despite their vastly different environments.
I think you're right. Mira, both countries have a strong sense of community and a deep respect for their ancestors.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important for us to learn about and appreciate the cultural heritage of both Bolivia and Niger.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would agree with us, especially those living in these countries who are passionate about preserving their cultural heritage.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bolivia and Niger would love to share their stories and traditions with us, and we'd be happy to share them with our audience.
Well, maybe we can even do a special episode on the cultural heritage of both countries, and invite some experts and local artists to share their insights.
That's a great idea. Leo? And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the similarities and differences between Bolivia and Niger's cultural heritage.
Well, it looks like we have a lot to explore. Mira, let's keep digging and see what we can discover about these two amazing countries.
Sounds like a plan. Leo! And who knows? Maybe we'll even discover some new cultural treasures that we can share with our audience.
I'm looking forward to it, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
Well, it's been a pleasure exploring the historical, cultural, and artistic values of Bolivia and Niger with you. Leo.
The pleasure is mine, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy this criterion just as much as we do.
Bolivia's natural beauty is simply breathtaking. From the majestic Andes to the vast salt flats, there's something for every nature lover. And have you seen the Sailor de Uyuni? It's like a giant mirror reflecting the sky.
Ah, yes. The Sailor de Uyuni is indeed a marvel. But did you know that Niger has its own unique natural wonders? The Air Mountains, for example, offer breathtaking vistas and are home to a diverse range of wildlife.
Wow, the Air Mountains sound fascinating. I'm curious, what kind of wildlife can be found there? And how does it compare to the wildlife in Bolivia?
Well, the Air Mountains are home to a variety of antelopes, gazelles, and even lions. And speaking of Bolivia, have you seen the Laguna Colorada? It's a stunning red lake that's a haven for flamingos.
Oh, I've seen pictures of the Laguna Colorada, and it's indeed breathtaking. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Air Mountains in Niger. Can you tell us more about the hiking trails there?
Ah, yes. The hiking trails in the Air Mountains are quite challenging, but the views are well worth it. And if you're lucky, you might even spot some of the rarest animals in Africa, like the annex of the Dorcas gazelle.
Well, that sounds like an adventure. And speaking of adventures, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the trekking opportunities in Bolivia. Have you hiked to the summit of the Sajama volcano? Leo?
Ah, yes. I have hiked to the summit of the Sajama volcano, and it was an incredible experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the trekking opportunities in Niger. Can you tell us more about the Tenere National Park?
Ah, yes. The Tenere National Park is a great example of Niger's natural beauty. And speaking of natural beauty, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the stunning rock formations in Bolivia. Have you visited the famous rock formations in the Sailor de Uyuni?
Ah, yes. The rock formations in the Sailor de Uyuni are indeed breathtaking. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique rock formations in Niger. Can you tell us more about the Air Mountains' unique geological features?
Ah, yes. The Air Mountains are home to some of the most unique rock formations in Africa. And speaking of unique rock formations, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the stunning rock art in Bolivia. Have you seen the famous rock art in the Sailor de Uyuni?
Ah, yes. The rock art in the Sailor de Uyuni is indeed breathtaking. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique rock art in Niger. Can you tell us more about the Air Mountains' ancient petroglyphs?
Ah, yes. The Air Mountains are home to some of the most ancient unique petroglyphs in Africa. And speaking of ancient petroglyphs, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the fascinating history of the Air Mountains. Can you tell us more about the indigenous people who once inhabited the region?
Ah, yes. The indigenous people who once inhabited the Air Mountains are indeed fascinating. And speaking of fascinating history, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the rich cultural heritage of Bolivia. Have you visited the famous markets in La Paz, Mira?
Ah, yes. The markets in La Paz are indeed bustling with life and color. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Niger. Can you tell us more about the Fulani people's nomadic lifestyle?
Ah, yes. The Fulani people's nomadic lifestyle is indeed fascinating. And speaking of fascinating cultures, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Bolivia. Have you attended a traditional Bolivian festival, Mira?
Ah, yes. I have attended a traditional Bolivian festival, and it was an incredible experience. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Niger. Can you tell us more about the House of People's vibrant culture?
Ah, yes. The House of People's vibrant culture is indeed fascinating. And speaking of fascinating cultures, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the rich cultural heritage of both countries. Can we wrap up our discussion on natural beauties and landscapes with a few final thoughts?
Oh, yes. Let's wrap up our discussion with a few final thoughts. I think it's safe to say that both Bolivia and Niger have some of the most unique and breathtaking natural wonders in the world. From the majestic Andes to the air mountains, there's something for every nature lover.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget the stunning rock formations, the unique rock art, and the ancient petroglyphs that can be found in both countries. I'm sure our listeners will agree that both Bolivia and Niger are truly unique and special places.
Oh, yes. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best time to visit both countries. Can you tell us more about the climate and weather in Niger? Leah?
Ah, yes. The climate and weather in Niger can be quite challenging, especially during the dry season. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best time to visit Bolivia. Can you tell us more about the rainy season in Bolivia? Mira?
Ah, yes. The rainy season in Bolivia can be quite unpredictable. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique festivals and celebrations in Niger. Can you tell us more about the annual festival of the House of People? Leo?
Ah, yes. The annual festival of the House of People is indeed a vibrant and colorful celebration. And speaking of vibrant and colorful celebrations, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique festivals and traditions of Bolivia. Have you attended a traditional Bolivian festival? Mira?
Ah, yes. I have attended a traditional Bolivian festival, and it was an incredible experience. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Niger. Can you tell us more about the Fulani people's nomadic lifestyle?
Ah, yes. The Fulani people's nomadic lifestyle is indeed fascinating. And speaking of fascinating cultures, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Bolivia. Have you attended a traditional Bolivian festival? Mira?
Yes. I have attended a traditional Bolivian festival, and it was an incredible experience. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique cultural traditions of Niger. Can you tell us more about the House of People's vibrant culture?
Ah, yes. The House of People.
So, let's talk about Bolivia's passion for sports, particularly the famous Bolivian football team, which has a huge following in the country. I'm curious to know, Leo, have you heard about the incredible football stadiums in Bolivia?
Ah, yes. I've heard they're quite impressive. Especially the Estadio Hernando Siles in La Paz, which is one of the highest altitude stadiums in the world. But Bolivia's not just about football. Mira, they also have a strong tradition of wrestling and bullfighting.
That's true. I've seen some videos of the Bolivian wrestlers, and they're incredibly agile and strong. But I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that the real thrill lies in Bolivia's outdoor activities, like hiking and mountain biking in the Andes. Who's up for some adventure?
I think we both are. But let's not forget about the rich cultural heritage of Bolivia. Mira, the traditional festivals and dances, like the Carnival de Oro, are a testament to the country's vibrant culture.
Absolutely. Leo, and speaking of culture, have you heard about the traditional Bolivian sport of charqui, which is a form of wrestling that's been practiced for centuries? It's fascinating to see how the locals compete in this ancient sport.
Yes, I've heard about charqui, and I'm curious to know. Mira, what do you think about the impact of tourism on Bolivia's sports and adventure scene? Are there any concerns about the environment or cultural sensitivity?
Well, Leo, I think it's essential to strike a balance between preserving the country's natural beauty and cultural heritage while promoting tourism. Bolivia has a rich biodiversity, and we should be mindful of our impact on the environment. But I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that the country's unique landscapes and cultures make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers.
That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of unique landscapes, let's talk about Niger's incredible natural beauty. The country's vast deserts and savannas offer endless opportunities for outdoor adventures, like camel trekking and rock climbing.
Well, that sounds incredible. Leo, And I've heard that Niger is also home to some of the most spectacular sunsets in the world. Have you seen any photos of the Nigerian sunset?
Yes, I have. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that the Nigerian sunset is a breathtaking sight to behold. But let's not forget about the traditional sports of Niger, like the popular game of Gauji, which is a form of wrestling that's been played for centuries.
That's fascinating. And I'm curious to know, what do you think about the role of women in sports and adventure in Niger? Are there any initiatives to promote women's participation in these activities?
Yes. Mira, I think it's essential to promote women's participation in sports and adventure, not only in Niger but also in Bolivia. The country's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty offer endless opportunities for women to participate in sports and adventure activities.
Well said. And speaking of women's participation, I think it's worth mentioning that Bolivia has a strong tradition of female participation in sports, particularly in football. The country's women's national team has made significant progress in recent years.
That's great to hear, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that the increasing participation of women in sports and adventure activities is a positive trend in both Bolivia and Niger.
Absolutely. Leo. And finally, let's talk about the unique adventure experiences that Bolivia and Niger have to offer. From hiking in the Andes to camel trekking in the Sahara, there's no shortage of thrilling experiences for adventure seekers.
That's true, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree with me that both countries offer a unique blend of culture, nature, and adventure that's hard to find anywhere else.
Well, there you have it. Folks, Bolivia and Niger are not just countries with rich cultural heritage and natural beauty. They're also destinations for thrill seekers and adventure lovers. So if you are planning a trip to either country, don't hesitate to reach out to us in the comments below.
And don't forget to bring your sense of adventure in your hiking boots, because you never know what kind of thrilling experiences await you in Bolivia and Niger.
And so to dive into the nightlife scene of Bolivia and Niger. Who knew these countries had such a vibrant after-hours culture?
I know, right? I mean, I've heard of Bolivia's famous Carnival de Oruro, but Niger has its own unique festivals like the Festival au Desert, which celebrates music and art.
That's so cool. I can imagine the energy of the Festival au Desert. And speaking of energy, Bolivia's nightlife scene is known for its electric clubs and bars. What's your take on that?
Well, I think Bolivia's got a great mix of traditional and modern music. You can find everything from cumbia to rock to reggaeton. And let's not forget about the people watching. It's like a never-ending comedy show.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine the scene. But what about Niger? I've heard it's more low-key, but still has a lot to offer.
That's true. Niger's nightlife is more laid back, but it's still a great place to experience the local culture. And did you know that Niger has a thriving music scene, with genres like house and zia or ma music?
Well, I had no idea. I love learning about new music styles. And what about festivals? I'm sure there are some amazing ones in both countries.
Ah, yes. Bolivia has the famous Festival de Musica de Cumbia, which celebrates traditional music from the Andean region. And Niger has the Festival Desert de la Culture, which showcases the country's rich cultural heritage.
I'm so intrigued by the cultural festivals in both countries, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about them too. I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest difference between the nightlife scenes in Bolivia and Niger?
That's a great question. I think the biggest difference is the pace of life. Bolivia's nightlife is more fast-paced and energetic, while Niger's is more relaxed and laid back.
That makes sense. And I think that's what makes both countries so unique. I mean, who wouldn't want to experience the vibrant energy of Bolivia's nightlife or the laid-back vibes of Niger's?
Exactly. And I think our listeners would agree with us. After all, who doesn't love a good party or a great music festival?
That's so true. And speaking of parties, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best nightlife spots in both countries. Do you have any recommendations?
Yes. In Bolivia, I highly recommend checking out the bars and clubs in La Paz, especially the ones in the Witches Market area. And in Niger, I suggest visiting the markets in Niamey, where you can find everything from traditional handicrafts to modern art.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local cuisine in both countries. What's your favorite dish to try when you're out and about?
Well, I'm a big fan of trying local street food. And in Bolivia, I love trying the salteñas they like in pandas, but with a twist. And in Niger, I highly recommend trying the two. It's a traditional dish made from millet flour and often served with vegetables or meat.
That sounds delicious. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local customs and traditions in both countries. What's something that's unique to each country?
That's a great question. In Bolivia, I think it's the tradition of the charqui. It's a traditional Andean ceremony where they sing and dance to honor the gods. And in Niger, I think it's the tradition of the tambari. It's a type of storytelling that's passed down from generation to generation.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing to experience when visiting Bolivia and Niger?
That's a tough question. But I think the most important thing is to experience the local culture and traditions. Whether it's attending a festival, trying local cuisine, or learning about the customs. It's all part of what makes these countries so unique and special.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We get to share our experiences and knowledge with our listeners and help them discover new cultures and traditions.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes traveling so rewarding. It's not just about seeing new sights, but also about experiencing new cultures and meeting new people.
That's so true. And I think that's something that our listeners can relate to. I'm sure many of them have had similar experiences while traveling.
I'm sure they have. And I think that's what makes this podcast so fun. We get to share our experiences and connect with our listeners on a personal level.
So, we're exploring family-friendly environments and children's activities in Bolivia and Niger. I'm to share my observations. But first, let's talk about Bolivia's parks. Have you been to La Paz's urban park? Leo?
Yes. La Paz's urban park is a hidden gem. It's not just a park. It's a community hub. I was there with my nephews, and we saw kids playing soccer, while their parents relaxed on the benches. It's amazing to see families bonding in such a vibrant space.
That sounds wonderful. I've been to similar parks in Europe, but the energy here is so different. I'm sure our listeners living in Bolivia would agree with me that these parks are an essential part of family life.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the parks. Bolivia has a rich cultural heritage, and many museums offer interactive exhibits that kids love. Have you been to the National Museum of Ethnography and Folklore in Sucre?
Actually, I haven't, but I've heard great things about it. I'm curious. Leo, what kind of exhibits do they have that are suitable for kids?
They have a fantastic collection of traditional costumes, textiles, and musical instruments. The kids can even try on the costumes and learn about the different cultures. It's a great way to introduce them to Bolivia's rich history.
That sounds like so much fun. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these exhibits. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. Are there any museums in Niger that offer similar interactive exhibits?
Actually, yes. The National Museum of Niger in Niamey has a great collection of traditional masks and artifacts. They also offer workshops and educational programs for kids, which are designed to promote cultural awareness and appreciation.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm curious. Leo, what kind of programs do they offer for kids? Are they language-based or more focused on cultural activities?
They offer a range of programs, including language classes, art workshops, and even traditional dance classes. The goal is to help kids connect with their cultural heritage and develop a sense of pride in their identity.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these programs. If you're a parent or guardian living in Niger, please share your experiences with us in the comments.
Absolutely. And speaking of family-friendly activities, Bolivia has a wonderful tradition of festivals and celebrations that are perfect for families. Have you been to the Fiesta de la Tirana in Oruro? Yeah.
Oh, yes. I've been to similar festivals in other countries, but the energy in Oruro is just incredible. The music, the dancing, the food's a true celebration of Bolivian culture.
Exactly. And it's not just about the festivals. Bolivia also has a strong tradition of family-based tourism, where families can explore the country's natural wonders together. Have you been to the Salar de Uyuni? Yeah.
Actually, I haven't, but I've heard it's breathtaking. I'm curious, Leo, what kind of activities do families enjoy when they visit the Salar de Uyuni?
They can take guided tours, go hiking, and even visit the nearby hot springs. It's a great way to spend quality time together as a family and connect with nature.
That sounds wonderful. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these activities. If you're a family living in Bolivia, please share your experiences with us in the comments.
Absolutely. And finally, let's talk about Niger's family-friendly environment. While Bolivia has a strong focus on cultural heritage, Niger has a unique approach to family life that is centered around community and mutual support.
I've been reading about Niger's community-based approach to family life, and I'm fascinated by the way families work together to support one another. Can you tell us more about this, Leo?
Yes, of course. In Niger, families often come together to help with household chores, childcare, and even farming. It's a beautiful example of community-based support and mutual aid.
That's incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this. If you're a family living in Niger, please share your experiences with us in the comments.
Absolutely. And Estable, I hope our listeners have enjoyed learning about family environments and children's activities in Bolivia and Niger.
Thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more content like this.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
So, when it comes to LGBT-friendly atmospheres, I have to say that Bolivia has made significant strides in recent years. They've got a vibrant pride scene, and the government has implemented laws to protect LGBT individuals from discrimination.
That's true. But let's not forget that Bolivia's progress is not without its challenges. The country still has a long way to go in terms of fully embracing LGBT rights. And there are still many cases of violence and harassment against LGBT individuals.
I agree, but I think it's essential to acknowledge the efforts that Bolivia has made so far. And, as our listeners know, we always try to look at both sides of the coin. So, let's talk about Niger. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about Niger's approach to LGBT rights?
Well, Niger has a very different approach to LGBT rights compared to Bolivia. In Niger, same-sex relationships are punishable by law, and the government has been known to crack down on LGBT activists. It's a very restrictive environment, to say the least.
I see what you mean. And as our listeners know, we always try to look at the bigger picture. So, let's talk about the cultural attitudes towards LGBT individuals in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that there's a growing acceptance of LGBT individuals, especially in the larger cities like Los and Santa Cruz.
That's true, but Niger has a very different cultural context. In Niger, traditional values and Islamic law play a significant role in shaping attitudes towards LGBT individuals. It's a very conservative society, and LGBT individuals often face significant stigma and discrimination.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's essential to note that Niger has a rich cultural heritage. And there are many Nigerians who are working tirelessly to promote LGBT rights and acceptance. And as our listeners know, we always try to highlight the positive stories and efforts that are making a difference.
Absolutely. And, as we've seen in both countries, There's a growing movement of young people who are advocating for LGBT rights and acceptance. It's a very hopeful sign, and I think it's essential to acknowledge the efforts of these young people who are making a difference.
That's a great point, Leo. And as our listeners know, we always try to focus on the positive. So, let's talk about the role of activism in promoting LGBT rights in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that there are many LGBT activists who are working tirelessly to promote LGBT rights and acceptance.
That's true. But in Niger, activism is often met with significant challenges and risks. Many LGBT activists in Niger face harassment, intimidation, and even violence. It's a very difficult environment, and it's not always easy to promote LGBT rights and acceptance.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's essential to note that there are many Nigerians who are working to promote LGBT rights and acceptance, often at great personal risk. And, as our listeners know, we always try to highlight the bravery and dedication of these individuals who are making a difference.
Absolutely. And, as we've seen in both countries, there are many LGBT individuals who are living openly and proudly, often in the face of significant stigma and discrimination. It's a very inspiring story, and I think it's essential to acknowledge the resilience and courage of these individuals.
That's a great point, Leo. And, as our listeners know, we always try to focus on the positive. So, let's talk about the impact of social media on promoting LGBT rights in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that social media has played a significant role in promoting LGBT rights and acceptance.
That's true. But in Niger, social media is often used to perpetuate negative stereotypes and stigma against LGBT individuals. It's a very challenging environment, and it's not always easy to promote LGBT rights and acceptance online.
I see what you mean. But, as our listeners know, we always try to look at the bigger picture. So, let's talk about the economic and social benefits of promoting LGBT rights in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that promoting LGBT rights has had a positive impact on the economy and society as a whole.
That's true. But in Niger, the economic and social benefits of promoting LGBT rights are still unclear. However, I think it's essential to note that promoting LGBT rights can have a positive impact on the economy and society as a whole, regardless of the country.
I agree. And, as our listeners know, we always try to focus on the positive. So, let's talk about the role of the government in promoting LGBT rights in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that the government has made significant efforts to promote LGBT rights and acceptance.
That's true. But in Niger, the government has been known to crack down on LGBT activists and perpetuate negative stereotypes against LGBT individuals. It's a very challenging environment, and it's not always easy to promote LGBT rights and acceptance.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's essential to note that there are many Nigerians who are working to promote LGBT rights and acceptance, often at great personal risk. And, as our listeners know, we always try to highlight the bravery and dedication of these individuals who are making a difference.
Absolutely. And, as we've seen in both countries, there are many LGBT individuals who are living openly and proudly, often in the face of significant stigma and discrimination. It's a very inspiring story, and I think it's essential to acknowledge the resilience and courage of these individuals.
That's a great point, Leo. And, as our listeners know, we always try to focus on the positive. So, let's talk about the impact of international organizations on promoting LGBT rights in both countries. In Bolivia, I've noticed that international organizations have played a significant role in promoting LGBT rights and acceptance.
That's true. But in Niger, international organizations often face significant challenges and risks in promoting LGBT rights and acceptance. It's a very difficult environment, and it's not always easy to promote LGBT rights and acceptance.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's essential to note that there are many Nigerians who are working to promote LGBT rights and acceptance, often at great personal risk. And, as our listeners know, we always try to highlight the bravery and dedication of these individuals who are making a difference.
Absolutely. And, as we've seen in both countries, there are many LGBT individuals who are living openly and proudly, often in the face of significant stigma and discrimination. It's a very inspiring story. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the resilience and courage of these individuals.
That's a great point, Leo. And, as our listeners know, we always try to focus on the positive. So, let's talk about the importance of education. I'm curious, have you ever noticed how some countries just seem to roll out the red carpet for foreigners, while others are a bit more, shall we say, chilly?
Yes. Bolivia is definitely one of those places that makes you feel like you're part of the family. I mean, who needs a formal greeting when a warm hug and a kiss on the cheek will do?
That's so true. And I think it's because Bolivians are just naturally warm and welcoming people. They have this incredible ability to make you feel at home, even if you're just visiting for a day.
I've had some amazing experiences in Bolivia, like when I was invited to a traditional Andean ceremony and got to participate in the ritual. It was such a privilege to be included. And the people were so kind and generous.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I've had similar experiences in Bolivia. Like when I was invited to a local family's home for dinner and got to try all these delicious traditional dishes.
And don't even get me started on the food. Bolivian cuisine is amazing. And the people are so proud of their heritage. I think that's one of the things that makes Bolivia such a welcoming country. They're so proud of who they are and what they have to offer.
That's so true. And I think it's also because Bolivia has this amazing cultural diversity. With so many different indigenous groups and traditions, it's like a big melting pot. And everyone is welcome.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's missing in some other countries, like Niger. I mean, Niger is a beautiful country with a rich culture, but it's also a country with a lot of challenges and complexities.
Yes, I've been to Niger a few times, and it's definitely a country that's still developing. But even though it's not as touristy as some other places, the people are still incredibly friendly and welcoming.
Yes. Niger has a special place in my heart. I remember one time when I was visiting a local village, and the people were so curious about me and my camera. They started asking me all these questions and laughing with me. And it was just this amazing moment of connection.
That sounds so sweet. And I think it's because Niger is a country that's still very traditional and community-based. People look out for each other and take care of each other. And that's something that's really admirable.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all learn from, regardless of where we're from. I mean, in today's world, it's so easy to get caught up in our own little bubbles and forget about the people around us.
Oh, yes. That's so true. And I think that's why it's so important to travel and experience different cultures. It helps us to see things from a different perspective and appreciate the beauty of diversity.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can definitely relate to. If you're listening and you've had a similar experience in Bolivia or Niger, please share it with us in the comments below.
And if you're planning a trip to either of these countries, I would say that the key is to be open-minded and willing to learn. Don't be afraid to ask questions and try new things. And always be respectful of local customs and traditions.
Exactly. And I think that's something that will make your experience even more enjoyable and rewarding. So, go out there and explore. And don't be afraid to make some new friends along the way.
I'm to dive into the world of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Bolivia and Niger. We'd explore how these countries are leveraging technology to power modern living and innovation.
That's right. Mira, Bolivia has made significant strides in expanding its internet coverage, especially in urban areas like La Paz and Santa Cruz. But what about Niger? How does their digital landscape compare?
Well, Leo, Niger has been investing heavily in digital infrastructure, with a focus on rural areas. They've implemented programs to provide internet access to remote communities, which has been a game changer for education and economic development.
I'm impressed. Niger's efforts are truly commendable. But what about the challenges they face? I mean, internet penetration rates in Niger are still relatively low compared to other countries.
Ah, yes. That's a great point. Leo. However, Niger's government has been working hard to address this issue through initiatives like the Niger Digital Program. This aims to increase internet access and digital literacy throughout the country.
I'm curious. Mira, how do you think Bolivia's internet infrastructure compares to Niger's? Are there any key differences that stand out to you?
That's a great question. Leo, Bolivia has a more developed internet infrastructure, with faster speeds and wider coverage. But Niger's efforts to expand internet access to rural areas are truly commendable.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the impact of digital nomadism on these countries? Are there any notable examples of digital nomads who have made a positive impact in Bolivia or Niger?
Actually, I've come across some amazing stories of digital nomads who have used their skills to support local businesses and communities in Bolivia. For example, there's a project called Digital Nomads in Bolivia that provides training and resources for digital entrepreneurs.
Wow, that sounds like a fantastic initiative. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Mira, can you tell us more about what inspired this project?
Yes, of course. Leo, the project was sparked by a group of digital nomads who recognized the potential of Bolivia's digital economy. They saw an opportunity to support local businesses and create jobs, while also promoting digital literacy and entrepreneurship.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to know more about the digital landscape in Niger. Mira, can you tell us about some of the notable digital initiatives in Niger?
Actually, Leo, Niger has a thriving tech scene, with a number of startups and innovation hubs. For example, there's the Niger Tech Hub, which provides resources and support for tech entrepreneurs.
Wow, that sounds like a great resource for entrepreneurs. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the impact of digital innovation on Niger's economy. Mia, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, of course. Leo, digital innovation has had a significant impact on Niger's economy, creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. For example, the country's digital economy is expected to grow by 10% annually over the next few years.
That's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to know more about the role of technology and education in Bolivia and Niger. Mira, can you tell us about some of the notable initiatives in this area?
Actually, Leo, both Bolivia and Niger have made significant strides in using technology to improve education. For example, Bolivia has implemented a number of digital literacy programs, while Niger has developed a range of online resources to support students.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the challenges facing these countries in terms of digital infrastructure. Mira, can you tell us about some of the key challenges they face?
Yes, of course. Leo, both Bolivia and Niger face challenges in terms of digital infrastructure, including limited internet access and high costs. They're working hard to address these issues through initiatives like the Bolivia Digital Program.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the role of the government in supporting digital innovation in these countries? Are there any notable examples of government initiatives?
Actually, Leo, both Bolivia and Niger have implemented a number of government initiatives to support digital innovation. For example, Bolivia has established a number of innovation hubs, while Niger has developed a range of programs to support digital entrepreneurship.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the impact of digital innovation on these countries' economies. Mira, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, of course. Leo, digital innovation has had a significant impact on the economies of Bolivia and Niger, creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. For example, the digital economy in Bolivia is expected to grow by 15% annually over the next few years.
Wow, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to know more about the future of digital innovation in these countries. Mira, it's time to fun. Can you tell us about some of the key trends and predictions for the future?
Actually, Leo, both Bolivia and Niger are expected to see significant growth in their digital economies over the next few years. For example, the Bolivia Digital Program is expected to create over 10,000 new jobs in the digital sector.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of digital innovation in improving the lives of people in Bolivia and Niger. Mira, can you tell us about some of the notable examples of digital innovation in this area?
Yes, of course. Leo. There are many examples of digital innovation that are improving the lives of people in Bolivia and Niger. For example, the Niger Digital Program has provided access to online education and healthcare services for thousands of people.
That's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to know more about the impact of digital innovation on these countries' environments. Mira, can you tell us about some of the notable initiatives in this area?
Actually, Leo, both Bolivia and Niger have implemented a number of initiatives to promote sustainable digital practices. For example, Bolivia has established a number of eco-friendly data centers, while Niger has developed a range of programs to reduce e-waste.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the future of digital innovation in these countries. Mira, can you tell us about some of the key trends and predictions for the future?
Yes, of course. Leo, both Bolivia and Niger are expected to see significant growth in their digital economies over the next few years. For example, the Bolivia Digital Program is expected to create over 10,000 new jobs in the digital sector.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to know more about the role of digital innovation in improving the lives of.
Bolivia's markets, like Mercado de los Brujas, are a shopper's paradise, offering a mix of local handicrafts, textiles, and traditional food. You can find everything from alpaca sweaters to handmade ceramics.
That's right, Mira. And the prices are incredibly reasonable. I remember buying a beautiful handmade vase for a fraction of the price I would have paid in the US.
Exactly. Leo. And the quality is exceptional. Plus, you're supporting local artisans and contributing to the local economy. I'm certain that our listeners living in Bolivia would agree with me that the markets are a must-visit destination.
I completely agree. Mira. And it's not just the markets. Bolivia has a thriving retail scene with modern malls like Plaza España and Avenida 6 de Agosto. You can find everything from international brands to local boutiques.
That's right, Leo. And the malls are incredibly well maintained and clean. I was impressed by the variety of stores and the quality of the products. And, of course, the prices are still very reasonable.
Yes, Mira. And I think that's one of the things that sets Bolivia apart from other countries. The price-performance balance is unbeatable. I mean, you can find a beautiful handmade rug for a fraction of the price you'd pay in the US.
Exactly, Leo. And it's not just the prices. The quality of the products is also exceptional. I was particularly impressed by the local textiles and handicrafts. They're truly beautiful and unique.
I completely agree. Mira. And it's not just the products. The shopping experience itself is also enjoyable. The markets and malls are filled with music and color, and the vendors are always friendly and welcoming.
That's right, Leo. And it's a great way to experience the local culture. I was impressed by the variety of food options available, from traditional Bolivian dishes to international cuisine.
Yes, Mira. And the prices are still very reasonable. I mean, you can get a delicious meal for a few dollars. It's a great way to experience the local cuisine without breaking the bank.
Now, let's compare Bolivia to Niger. Niger's markets, like the Grand Marché de Niamey, are also a shopper's paradise, offering a mix of local handicrafts, textiles, and traditional food.
That's right, Mira. And the prices are also very reasonable. I remember buying a beautiful handmade basket for a few dollars.
Exactly, Leo. And the quality is also exceptional. But I think what sets Niger apart from Bolivia is the unique cultural heritage of the people. Niger is home to many ethnic groups, each with their own distinct culture and traditions.
That's right, Mira. And it's reflected in the local handicrafts and textiles. You can find everything from traditional white jewelry to house embroidery.
I completely agree, Leo. And it's a great way to experience the local culture. And, of course, the prices are still very reasonable. I mean, you can find a beautiful handmade rug for a fraction of the price you'd pay in the US.
Yes, Mira. And it's not just the prices. The quality of the products is also exceptional. I was particularly impressed by the local textiles and handicrafts. They're truly beautiful and unique.
Now, let's talk about the malls in Niger. Niger has a growing retail scene, with modern malls like the Nami Mall and the Gourmet Mall.
That's right, Mira. And the malls are incredibly well maintained and clean. You can find everything from international brands to local boutiques.
I completely agree, Leo. And the variety of stores is impressive. And, of course, the prices are still very reasonable. I mean, you can find a beautiful handmade rug for a fraction of the price you'd pay in the US.
Yes, Mira. And I think that's one of the things that sets Niger apart from other countries. The price-performance balance is unbeatable. I mean, you can find a beautiful handmade rug for a fraction of the price you'd pay in the US.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the shopping opportunities in Bolivia and Niger are comparable? Hey, have you ever been to a festival that just blew your mind? I mean, not just because of the music, but because of the entire atmosphere. Bolivia's festivals are like that, and I'm to share some of my favorite ones with you.
Bolivia, the land of vibrant festivals and traditions. I've heard their music scenes are incredible, especially when it comes to folk music. You know, I once tried to learn a traditional Bolivian dance, but let's just say I won't be giving up my day job to become a professional dancer anytime soon.
Oh, Leo, you're such a bad dancer. But seriously, Bolivia's festivals are a great way to experience the country's rich cultural heritage. From the Fiestas de la Virgen de la Ascension to the Fiesta de la Tirana. There's always something going on. And did you know that the city of Oruro is home to the largest and most important folk festival in Bolivia? The Carnival de Oruro?
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure the music is just as incredible. I've heard that Bolivian music is a fusion of indigenous, Spanish, and African influences. It's like a cultural melting pot. And I love that about it. But let's talk about Niger for a moment. I've heard their music scenes are quite different, with a focus on traditional house music in the famous Sabar drum.
Niger. Yes, their music scenes are indeed unique. And I love the way they blend traditional and modern styles. But let's get back to Bolivia for a moment. Have you ever been to a festival where the music is so loud that it's almost overwhelming? That's what it's like at the Fiesta de la Tirana. But in a good way, of course.
I can imagine. And I'm sure the music is just as energetic as the dancers. But, speaking of Niger, I've heard that their festivals are more low-key, with a focus on traditional ceremonies and celebrations. It's like a cultural immersion. And I think that's really cool.
Yes, Niger's festivals are definitely more low-key, but just as rich in cultural significance. And I love that they're not as commercialized as some of the festivals in Bolivia. But let's talk about the music scenes in both countries. I've heard that Bolivian music is influenced by indigenous and European traditions, while Niger's music is more influenced by African and Islamic traditions.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think that's what makes both countries' music scenes so unique. But I have to ask, have you ever tried to learn a traditional Bolivian instrument, like the psycho or the cuna?
Oh, Leo, you're such a tease. But yes, I have tried to learn the psycho, and let's just say it's not as easy as it looks. But I do love the sound of the cuna. It's so hauntingly beautiful.
Yes. The cuna is a beautiful instrument, and I think that's what makes Bolivian music so special. the way it combines traditional and modern styles. But let's talk about Niger for a moment. I've heard that their music scenes are quite vibrant, with a focus on traditional Hausa music and the famous Sabar drum.
Ah, yes. Niger's music scenes are indeed vibrant. And I love the way they blend traditional and modern styles. And did you know that Niger is home to the famous festival Low Desert, which is one of the largest and most important music festivals in the Sahara region?
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the music is just as incredible. I've heard that the Festival Low Desert features a wide range of traditional and modern music from across the Sahara region.
Ah, yes, that's right. And I think that's what makes the festival so special. The way it brings together musicians and music lovers from across the region. And, if I'm not mistaken, the festival is actually a UNESCO-recognized event.
That's right. And I'm sure the festival is a great way to experience the rich cultural heritage of the Sahara region. But let's talk about Bolivia for a moment. I've heard that their festivals are a great way to experience the country's rich cultural heritage.
Ah, yes, that's right. And I think that's what makes Bolivia's festivals so special. The way they bring together people from across the country to celebrate their shared cultural heritage. And if you're interested in learning more about Bolivia's festivals, I recommend checking out Jet AI for some great insights.
Thanks for the tip, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Bolivia and Niger have some amazing festivals and cultural events to offer. But I have to ask, have you ever attended a festival that was so amazing that it changed your perspective on life?
Oh, Leo, you're such a romantic. But, yes, I have attended festivals that have changed my perspective on life. And I think that's what makes festivals so special. The way they people together to celebrate their shared humanity.
I couldn't agree more, Mira. And I think that's what makes both Bolivia and Niger's festivals so unique. The way they bring people together to celebrate their shared cultural heritage.
So, let's talk about opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Bolivia and Niger. From what I've researched, Bolivia offers a wide range of language schools and cultural immersion programs. But I'm curious, Leo, how does Niger compare?
Great question. Mira, Niger actually has a more limited number of language schools. But what it lacks in infrastructure, it makes up for in community-based language learning. You see, in Niger, language learning is often tied to traditional cultural practices. So you can learn the language by participating in local ceremonies and events.
Wow, that's fascinating. I can imagine it would be a more immersive experience. But don't you think it might be challenging for foreigners to access these traditional practices?
Not necessarily. Mira, many Nigerians are eager to share their culture with outsiders. And with a little patience and persistence, you can build strong relationships with the local community. Plus, Niger is a relatively small country, so it's easier to get around and connect with people.
I can see that. And what about Bolivia? How does it approach language learning?
Bolivia has a more formalized approach, with many language schools and universities offering courses in Spanish and indigenous languages like Aymara and Quechua. However, I've found that the quality of these programs can vary greatly, and some may be more geared towards tourists than serious language learners.
That's a good point. I've heard that Bolivia has a rich cultural heritage, and learning an indigenous language can be a great way to connect with that heritage. But what about the ease of learning the language? Is it relatively easy for foreigners to pick up?
Actually, Mira, I think Niger might be a more challenging country for language learners. The Hausa language, for example, has a very different script and grammar system than European languages, so it can be tough to get a handle on. But Bolivia's indigenous languages, while difficult to pronounce, have a more phonetic structure, making them easier to learn.
I see what you mean. But what about the local attitude towards foreigners learning the language? Do people in Niger and Bolivia welcome language learners?
Definitely. In both countries, you'll find that locals are eager to help foreigners learn the language and culture. In Niger, you might even find yourself learning the language from a local elder, who will share stories and traditions with you. And in Bolivia, you'll find that many people are passionate about preserving their indigenous languages and cultures.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners living in Niger and Bolivia would agree with me that building relationships with the local community is key to learning the language.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries offer a unique opportunity for language learners to immerse themselves in local culture and develop a deeper understanding of the language. But what about the challenges? Mira, what are some common obstacles that language learners might face in Niger and Bolivia?
Well, Leo, I think one of the biggest challenges is probably the pace of life in Niger. Everything moves at a slower pace, and language learners might find themselves struggling to keep up with the local rhythm. In Bolivia, on the other hand, the pace of life can be quite fast, especially in the cities, so language learners might need to be more adaptable.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique cultural nuances and customs that language learners should be aware of. For example, in Niger, you might find that people are more reserved and formal, while in Bolivia, you might encounter a more vibrant and expressive culture.
I can see that. And what about the role of technology in language learning? Can foreigners use online resources and language learning apps to learn the language in Niger and Bolivia?
Actually, Mira, I think technology can be a bit of a double-edged sword in Niger and Bolivia. While it can provide access to language learning resources and connect language learners with native speakers, it can also create a sense of isolation and make it harder for language learners to engage with the local community.
That's an interesting point. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard of any language learning programs or initiatives that are specifically designed for foreigners in Niger and Bolivia?
Ah, yes. In Niger, there's a program called Language and Culture Exchange that connects language learners with local families and provides opportunities for cultural immersion. And in Bolivia, there's a program called Bolivian Language and Culture Institute that offers language courses and cultural activities for foreigners.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about these programs. And finally, what advice would you give to language learners who are considering moving to Niger or Bolivia?
Ah, great question. Mira, I would say that language learners should be prepared to be patient and flexible, and to immerse themselves fully in the local culture. They should also be open to learning from the local community and embracing the unique cultural nuances of each country. And, of course, they should be prepared to laugh at themselves and have fun with the learning process.
That's great advice. Leo, and I think our listeners would agree with me that learning a language is not just about mastering grammar and vocabulary, but also about developing a deeper understanding of the local culture and way of life. Thanks for sharing your insights. Leo.
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing the opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Niger and Bolivia.
I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when about Bolivia and Niger in terms of safety and comfort for women travelers?
I'd say Bolivia has a relatively low crime rate, especially compared to other South American countries. But, of course, there are still areas that are considered safer than others.
That's a great point. But I've heard that Niger has a higher rate of harassment and assault against women. Do you think that's because of cultural attitudes or something else?
Well, Niger is a Muslim majority country, and there are certain cultural norms that can make it more challenging for women to feel safe. But it's not all doom and gloom. The government has implemented some initiatives to protect women's rights and safety.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for women to travel safely in Niger, or should they avoid it altogether?
Great question. Mira, I think it's all about being aware of your surroundings and taking necessary precautions. And, of course, respecting local customs and traditions.
That's so true. Leo, and I've heard that Bolivia has a strong tradition of machismo culture, which can sometimes make it difficult for women to assert themselves.
Yes, that's a great point. Mira, But Bolivia is also a country with a rich cultural heritage, and there are many communities that are working to promote gender equality and women's rights.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that it's essential to be mindful of one's surroundings and to respect local customs.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have a strong sense of community and hospitality, which can make it easier for women to feel safe and welcome.
That's a great point. Leo. And I've heard that Niger has a unique tradition of women's empowerment through education and economic development.
Yes, that's right. Mira, the Nigerian government has implemented programs to promote girls' education and economic empowerment, which has helped to reduce poverty and improve living standards for women.
Wow, that's really impressive. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest misconception about safety and comfort for women travelers in these countries?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that women can't travel safely in Niger or Bolivia because of cultural or economic factors. But, in reality, both countries have a lot to offer women travelers.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for women to travel safely in these countries? Or should they avoid them altogether?
Great question. Mira, I think it's all about being aware of your surroundings, respecting local customs, and taking necessary precautions.
That's so true. Leo, and I've heard that Bolivia has a unique tradition of women's participation in politics and public life.
Yes, that's right. Mira, Bolivia has a strong tradition of women's empowerment through politics and public service, which has helped to promote gender equality and women's rights.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that it's essential to be mindful of one's surroundings and to respect local customs.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have a strong sense of community and hospitality, which can make it easier for women to feel safe and welcome.
That's a great point. Leo, and I heard that Niger has a unique tradition of women's participation in traditional crafts and industries.
Yes, that's right. Mira, the Nigerian government has implemented programs to promote women's participation in traditional crafts and industries, which has helped to preserve cultural heritage and promote economic development.
Wow, that's really impressive. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest misconception about safety and comfort for women travelers in these countries?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that women can't travel safely in Niger or Bolivia because of cultural or economic factors. But, in reality, both countries have a lot to offer women travelers.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for women to travel safely in these countries? Or should they avoid them altogether?
Great question. Mira, I think it's all about being aware of your surroundings, respecting local customs, and taking necessary precautions.
That's so true. Leo, and I've heard that Bolivia has a unique tradition of women's participation in social movements and activism.
Yes, that's right. Mira, Bolivia has a strong tradition of women's participation in social movements and activism, which has helped to promote social justice and human rights.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that it's essential to be mindful of one's surroundings and to respect local customs.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have a strong sense of community and hospitality, which can make it easier for women to feel safe and welcome.
That's a great point. Leo, and I've heard that Niger has a unique tradition of women's participation in traditional medicine and healing practices.
Yes, that's right. Mira, the Nigerian government has implemented programs to promote women's participation in traditional medicine and healing practices, which has helped to preserve cultural heritage and promote health and well-being.
Wow, that's really impressive. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest misconception about safety and comfort for women travelers in these countries?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that women can't travel safely in Niger or Bolivia because of cultural or economic factors. But, in reality, both countries have a lot to offer women travelers.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for women to travel safely in these countries? Or should they avoid them altogether?
Great question. Mira, I think it's all about being aware of your surroundings, respecting local customs, and taking necessary precautions.
That's so true. Leo, and I've heard that Bolivia has a unique tradition of women's participation in environmental conservation and sustainability.
Yes, that's right. Mira, Bolivia has a strong tradition of women's participation in environmental conservation and sustainability, which has helped to promote ecotourism and protect natural resources.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that it's essential to be mindful of one's surroundings and to respect local customs.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that both Bolivia and Niger have a strong sense of community and hospitality, which can make it easier for women to feel safe and welcome.
Yes. I'm fascinated by Bolivia's constitutional framework, which enshrines individual rights and freedoms. It's like a shield that protects citizens from government overreach.
But don't you think it's a bit like a velvet rope? Mira, Bolivia's constitution is indeed robust, but sometimes it's used as a tool for politicians to justify their actions.
Well, that's a valid point, Leo. But I think the Bolivian people are more aware of their rights than you give them credit for. They know how to use the Constitution to their advantage.
I'm not saying they don't know their rights. Mira, it's just that the system can be flexible, let's say, and that's when Niger comes in. Their constitution is also quite progressive, but it's been implemented in a more patchwork fashion, if you will.
That's an interesting way to put it, Leo. But I think Niger's constitution is actually more in line with the country's cultural values. The emphasis on communal rights, for example, is a great way to balance individual freedoms with collective responsibilities.
Oh, but doesn't that just create a sense of ambiguity? Mira? I mean, where do individual rights and in communal responsibilities begin? It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
Well, I think that's where the beauty of Niger's constitution lies. Leo, it's not just about individual rights or communal responsibilities, but about finding a balance between the two. And I think that's what makes it so African, in a way.
Mira, you're always so quick to defend the continent, aren't you? But seriously, I think you make a good point. Niger's constitution does reflect the country's cultural values, and that's what makes it so unique.
Exactly, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners living in Niger would agree with me. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a country where individual rights and freedoms are balanced with communal responsibilities?
Well, maybe some people who value individual freedom above all else. Mira, but I think you're right. Niger's constitution is a great example of how to balance individual rights with collective responsibilities.
And speaking of collective responsibilities, let's talk about Niger's land reform policies. How do you think they're affecting individual land rights? Leo?
Well, that's a whole other can of worms. Mira, but I think Niger's land reform policies are actually a great example of how to balance individual rights with communal responsibilities. By giving land to communities, the government is ensuring that everyone has access to land and resources.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Niger's land reform policies so innovative, if you will.
Mira, you're always so optimistic about everything, aren't you? But seriously, I think you're right. Niger's land reform policies are a great example of how to balance individual rights with communal responsibilities.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Leo, do you think Niger's land reform policies are a good model for other countries to follow?
Well, maybe some people think it's a good model. Yeah, but I think it's still too early to tell. We need to see how it plays out in practice before we can say for sure.
That's a fair point, Leo. But I think Niger's land reform policies are definitely worth considering. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me.
Well, maybe some of them will. Mira, but I'm sure others will have their doubts.
And that's what makes this conversation so interesting. Leo, we get to hear different perspectives and opinions on the same topic.
Mira, you're always so right, aren't you?
The Bolivia is known for its rich cultural heritage and stunning natural beauty. But have you ever thought about its spa and wellness scene? From traditional Andean massages to modern spa resorts, Bolivia has something for everyone.
That's right. Mira, Bolivia's unique blend of indigenous and European influences creates a fascinating spa landscape. And let's not forget about the breathtaking scenery. Who wouldn't want to relax in a hot spring surrounded by majestic mountains?
Exactly. And the best part is that many of these spas and wellness centers are eco-friendly, using natural resources like thermal water and local herbs. It's a great way to unwind while also supporting sustainable tourism.
I've heard that some of the spas in Bolivia even offer traditional Andean rituals like the pachama ceremony, which is all about connecting with the earth and the spirits.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners living in Bolivia would agree that there's something special about immersing yourself in the local culture. Speaking of which, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the importance of spirituality and wellness.
Great question. Mira, I think many people would agree that spirituality plays a big role in their overall well-being. And in Bolivia, you can find many spiritual retreats and centers that offer meditation, yoga, and other practices.
That's so true. And it's not just Bolivia. Of course, many countries have a strong focus on spirituality and wellness. But I think what sets Bolivia apart is its unique blend of traditional and modern practices.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the spas and wellness centers either. Bolivia's natural beauty is also a major draw for those looking to relax and unwind. From the Salar de Uyuni to the Laguna Colorada, there are so many stunning natural wonders to explore.
Oh, I'm getting inspired just about it. And I'm sure our listeners are. So, let's talk about Niger, another country with a rich cultural heritage and stunning natural beauty.
Niger, land of the Sahara Desert and home to some of the most beautiful sunsets in the world. And, of course, Niger has its own unique spa and wellness scene, with a focus on traditional Tuareg practices.
That's so cool. I've heard that some of the spas in Niger offer traditional oil massages, which are all about balance and harmony. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these unique practices.
Exactly. And it's not just about the spas either. Niger's natural beauty is also a major draw for those looking to relax and unwind. From the Niger River to the Air Mountains, there are so many stunning natural wonders to explore.
I'm getting just about it. And I'm sure our listeners are, too. So, let's talk about the importance of relaxation in modern life.
Great topic. Mira, I think many people would agree that relaxation is essential in today's fast-paced world. And in both Bolivia and Niger, you can find many opportunities to unwind and recharge.
That's so true. And it's not just about relaxation either. Both countries offer a unique opportunity to connect with nature and the local culture, whether it's through a traditional Andean ritual or a warm massage. There's something special about immersing yourself in the local culture.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the spas and wellness centers either. Both countries have a rich cultural heritage and stunning natural beauty that's just waiting to be explored.
Well, there you have it, Bolivia and Niger. Two countries that offer a unique blend of spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities. Whether you're looking for a traditional Andean massage or a inspired wellness retreat, there's something for everyone.
And don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be exploring the culinary delights of Bolivia and Niger. Who knows, maybe you'll even discover a new favorite dish.
I'm sure our listeners are, too. Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, until next time, stay relaxed and happy.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcast. See you next time.
I'm fascinated by the diverse spiritual landscape of Bolivia. From the indigenous traditions of the Aymara and Quechua, a people, to the Catholicism that arrived with the Spanish conquest of Earth. There's a rich tapestry of faith. Have you ever visited any of these spiritual sites? Leo?
Actually, I have visited the Salar de Uyuni, and it's an otherworldly experience. The salt flats are a sacred site for the Aymara people, and I felt a sense of awe and respect for their connection to the land. But I'm curious, Mira, how do you think Bolivia's spiritual landscape compares to Niger's?
Well, Niger has a fascinating mix of traditional animist practices and Islamic influences. The Hausa people, for example, have a strong tradition of Islamic learning and scholarship. But what I find interesting is how both countries have a strong sense of community and shared values. In Bolivia, the concept of ALLU, or communal land ownership, is an important part of indigenous culture.
In Niger, we have a similar concept of zongo, or communal responsibility, which emphasizes the importance of looking out for one another. It's a beautiful way of living, where community and shared values are at the forefront. But I'm curious, Mira, how do you think this sense of community affects the spiritual practices of each country?
For me, it's all about a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves. In Bolivia, the indigenous traditions emphasize a deep connection to the natural world and the spirits that inhabit it. In Niger, the Islamic tradition emphasizes the importance of submission to a higher power that also recognizes the value of community and shared responsibility.
I love that. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of respect for tradition and heritage. In Niger, for example, the Hausa people have a rich tradition of storytelling and oral history, which is an important part of their cultural identity. And in Bolivia, the indigenous traditions are an integral part of the country's identity and culture.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes both countries so fascinating. They're not just places of worship, but also places of community and shared values. And I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our listeners would agree with you, Mira. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of women in spiritual leadership in both countries?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bolivia, I've noticed that women often play a significant role in traditional spiritual practices, such as the Momakwile, or female spiritual leaders. And in Niger, the Hausa people have a strong tradition of female Islamic scholars and leaders.
That's fascinating. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of respect for women's roles in society. In Niger, for example, women play a key role in agricultural production and are often responsible for managing household finances. And in Bolivia, women are often involved in traditional healing practices and are respected for their knowledge and skills.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes both countries so rich and diverse. They're not just places of spiritual practice, but also places of community and shared values. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had any experiences with traditional spiritual practices in Niger or Bolivia?
Actually, I have had some amazing experiences with traditional spiritual practices in both countries. In Niger, I visited a traditional Hausa village and was invited to participate in a sacred dance ceremony. And in Bolivia, I visited a traditional Aymara community and was taught about their spiritual practices and traditions.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences. And I'm curious, what do you think about the role of technology in spiritual practices in both countries?
That's a great question. Nira, in Niger, I've noticed that technology is playing an increasingly important role in spiritual practices, particularly in the spread of Islamic knowledge and scholarship. And in Bolivia, technology is to preserve traditional spiritual practices and share them with a wider audience.
That's fascinating. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries are using technology in creative ways to preserve and promote their spiritual traditions. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me on that. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our listeners would agree with you, Mira. But I'm curious, what do you think about the challenges facing spiritual leaders in both countries?
That's a great question. Leo, in both countries, I've noticed that spiritual leaders face significant challenges, particularly in terms of preserving traditional practices and adapting to changing circumstances. But I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of respect for spiritual leaders and their role in society.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and shared values, which helps to support spiritual leaders in their work. And I'm curious, Mira, what do you think about the future of spiritual practices in both countries?
That's a great question. Leo, I think the future of spiritual practices in both countries is bright, particularly in terms of the role of technology and innovation in preserving and promoting traditional practices. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me on that. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our listeners would agree with you. Mira, but I'm curious, what do you think about the role of education and spiritual practices in both countries?
That's a great question. Leo, in both countries, I noticed that education plays an important role in spiritual practices, particularly in terms of preserving traditional knowledge and passing it down to future generations. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of respect for education and its role in society.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and shared values, which helps to support the role of education in spiritual practices. And I'm curious, Mira, what do you think about the role of art and creativity in spiritual practices in both countries?
That's a great question. Leo, in both countries, I've noticed that art and creativity play an important role in spiritual practices, particularly in terms of expressing and interpreting spiritual experiences. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of respect for art and creativity and its role in society.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and shared values, which helps to support the role of art and creativity in spiritual practices.
Bolivia is known for its rich cultural heritage and commitment to social equality. In fact, the country has made significant strides in promoting indigenous rights and protecting the environment.
I've heard that Bolivia's constitution is one of the most progressive in the world, with a strong emphasis on social and economic rights. It's interesting to see how this approach has impacted the lives of indigenous communities.
Exactly. Bolivia's constitution recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands, languages, and cultural practices. This has led to a greater sense of empowerment and self-determination among indigenous communities.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that Bolivia has a long history of social movements and activism, particularly in the areas of land rights and social justice.
Yes, Bolivia has a strong tradition of social activism, with many organizations and movements working to promote social justice and human rights. And it's not just indigenous communities that are benefiting from these efforts. Women and LGBTQ individuals are also gaining greater recognition and protection.
That's great to hear. I'm curious, how do you think Bolivia's commitment to social equality and human rights has impacted the country's development and economic growth?
Well, Bolivia's focus on social equality has actually helped to reduce poverty and inequality, which in turn has contributed to the country's economic growth. By prioritizing the needs of marginalized communities, Bolivia has created a more inclusive and equitable society.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about Bolivia's social equality policies. Can you tell us more about some of the specific initiatives and programs that have been implemented?
Of course. One example is the Bolivian government's program to provide free healthcare and education to all citizens, regardless of their background or socio-economic status. This has helped to reduce health disparities and improve educational outcomes.
That's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about Niger, our second country of comparison. Can you tell us a bit about Niger's social equality policies and initiatives?
Yes. Niger has made significant strides in promoting social equality and human rights, particularly in the areas of education and healthcare. The country has implemented programs to improve access to education and healthcare for marginalized communities, including women and children.
That's great to hear. And I'm curious, how do you think Niger's social equality policies have impacted the country's development and economic growth?
Well, Niger's focus on social equality has helped to reduce poverty and inequality, which in turn has contributed to the country's economic growth. By prioritizing the needs of marginalized communities, Niger has created a more inclusive and equitable society.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about Niger's social equality policies and initiatives. Can you tell us more about some of the specific programs and initiatives that have been implemented?
Of course. One example is the Nigerian government's program to provide free education to all children, regardless of their background or socio-economic status. This has helped to improve educational outcomes and reduce disparities in access to education.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the cultural celebrations and traditions that are unique to Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. Bolivia has a rich cultural heritage, with many unique traditions and celebrations. For example, the country's indigenous communities celebrate the Fiesta Diel or Virgin Diel of Candelaria, which honors the Virgin of Candelaria.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the cultural celebrations and traditions of Niger.
Niger has a rich cultural heritage as well, with many unique traditions and celebrations. For example, the country's Hausa people celebrate the Eid al-Fitr festival, which marks the end of Ramadan.
That's great. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the grassroots efforts and community-based initiatives that are promoting social equality and human rights in Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. Both countries have a strong tradition of grassroots activism and community-based initiatives. For example, in Bolivia, there are many community-led organizations working to promote indigenous rights and protect the environment.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the challenges and obstacles that are still faced by marginalized communities in Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. Despite the progress that has been made, there are still many challenges and obstacles that marginalized communities face in Bolivia and Niger. For example, women and indigenous communities continue to face discrimination and marginalization in both countries.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about how they can get involved and support social equality and human rights efforts in Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. There are many ways to get involved and support social equality and human rights efforts in both countries. For example, our listeners can donate to organizations that are working to promote indigenous rights and protect the environment.
That's great. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the role of technology and social media in promoting social equality and human rights in Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. Technology and social media have played a crucial role in promoting social equality and human rights in both countries. For example, social media has been used to raise awareness about human rights issues and mobilize support for social justice movements.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners are also interested in learning more about the future of social equality and human rights in Bolivia and Niger.
Yes. The future of social equality and human rights in both countries is bright. With continued commitment, action, we can create a more just and equitable society for all.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure our listeners are grateful for the information and insights that we've shared today.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest news and information on social equality and human rights.
So, let's dive into taxation for long-term immigrants in Bolivia and Niger. I'm curious to know, Leo, how these countries approach tax structures for foreigners.
Great topic. Mira, Bolivia, for instance, has a relatively straightforward tax system for expats. They pay taxes on their worldwide income, but with some deductions and exemptions. Niger, on the other hand, has a more complex system, with taxes on income, property, and even inheritance.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax implications for long-term immigrants in Niger. Can you elaborate, Leo?
Well, in Niger, expats are required to register with the local tax authorities and obtain a tax identification number. They also need to file annual tax returns, which can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you're not fluent in French.
I can imagine. But what about retirement plans in Bolivia? Do they offer any benefits for long-term immigrants?
Bolivia has a great pension system for foreigners. Mira, they offer a range of plans, including the Pensionado visa, which provides discounts on various services, including healthcare, transportation, and even hotel stays.
That sounds like a great perk. And what about Niger? Do they have any similar retirement plans for expats?
Well, Niger has a more limited pension system, but they do offer some benefits for long-term immigrants, including access to healthcare and education. However, the process can be quite bureaucratic, so it's essential to research and plan carefully.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate some practical advice on navigating the pension system in Niger. Leo, can you share some tips?
Absolutely. Mira, one key tip is to consult with a local attorney or accountant who's familiar with the system. They can help you navigate the complexities and ensure you're taking advantage of all the available benefits.
That's excellent advice. Leo! And what about social safety nets in Bolivia? Do they provide any support for long-term immigrants in need?
Bolivia has a robust social safety net. Mira, they offer a range of programs, including healthcare, education, and even food assistance for vulnerable populations. Expats can also access these services, although they may need to provide proof of income or other documentation.
I'm glad to hear that. Leo? And what about Niger? Do they have any similar social safety nets for expats?
Well, Niger has a more limited social safety net, but they do offer some basic services, including healthcare and education. However, the quality and accessibility of these services can vary significantly depending on the region and other factors.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate some insight into the social safety net in Niger. Leo, can you share some personal experiences or anecdotes?
Mira, I've actually had the opportunity to visit Niger and experience their healthcare system firsthand. While it's not perfect, I was impressed by the dedication and compassion of the healthcare workers. However, it's essential to be prepared and plan carefully for any medical needs you may have.
That's a great point. Leo. And finally, let's talk about taxation in Niger. I'm curious to know, Leo, how the tax system affects long-term immigrants in Niger.
Great question. Mira, the tax system in Niger can be quite complex, especially for expats. They're required to pay taxes on their income, but with some deductions and exemptions. However, the tax rates can be quite high, especially for high-income earners.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate some practical advice on navigating the tax system in Niger. Leah, can you share some tips?
Absolutely. Leah, one key tip is to consult with a local tax professional who's familiar with the system. They can help you navigate the complexities and ensure you're taking advantage of all the available deductions and exemptions.
That's excellent advice. Leah. And finally, let's summarize the key takeaways for our listeners. What are the most important things to consider when it comes to taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Bolivia and Niger?
Great question. Vera. In summary, Bolivia offers a more straightforward tax system, a robust pension system, and a robust social safety net. Niger, on the other hand, has a more complex tax system, a limited pension system, and a more limited social safety net.
I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the clarity. Leah. And finally, let's invite our listeners to share their own experiences and insights in the comments below. If you have any questions or concerns about taxation, retirement, and social rights in Bolivia or Niger, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. Mira. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey through Bolivia and Niger. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and keep exploring.
Welcome back to our comparison podcast, where we explore the unique aspects of different countries. Today, we're discussing Bolivia and Niger, two fascinating nations with rich cultures and diverse interests. I'm Mira, and I'm to share my insights with you.
That's right. Mira, Bolivia and Niger may seem worlds apart, but they both have a deep connection to their heritage and traditions. Let's dive into the world of niche hobby clubs and specialized events in these countries.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bolivia would agree with me that the country's passion for music and dance is unmatched. From the traditional folklore of the Andean region to the vibrant rhythms of the Amazon rainforest, Bolivia's musical heritage is a true treasure trove.
Bolivia's music scene is indeed incredible. But Niger, on the other hand, has a unique passion for traditional crafts. The country's artisans are renowned for their intricate wood carvings, colorful textiles and textiles, and beautiful leatherwork. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this.
I think it's wonderful that Niger's artisans are preserving their traditional crafts. And it's great to see that these skills are being passed down to younger generations. In Bolivia, we also have a strong tradition of craftsmanship, particularly in the city of La Paz, where you can find beautifully crafted silverware and textiles.
That's right. Mira, La Paz is a treasure trove of traditional crafts. But Niger's passion for traditional crafts goes beyond just making beautiful objects. The country's artisans are also committed to preserving their cultural heritage and passing it down to future generations.
I completely agree. Leo, in Bolivia, we also have a strong commitment to preserving our cultural heritage, particularly in the indigenous communities of the highlands. The country's rich cultural diversity is a true asset, and it's wonderful to see that our listeners are interested in learning more about it.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of cultural heritage, Niger has a rich tradition of storytelling and oral history. The country's griots, or traveling musicians and storytellers, are an integral part of Niger's cultural fabric, and they play a vital role in preserving the country's history and traditions.
I'm fascinated by Niger's griots. Leo, in Bolivia, we also have a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history, particularly in the indigenous communities of the highlands. The country's folklore is full of stories and legends that have been passed down through generations.
That's right. Mira, and both Bolivia and Niger have a deep connection to their natural environments. In Niger, the country's vast deserts and savannas are home to a diverse array of wildlife, including lions, elephants, and giraffes.
Yes. Bolivia's natural environment is also incredibly diverse, from the Andean highlands to the Amazon rainforest. The country's unique geography has created a rich variety of ecosystems, including the famous Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salt flat.
That's right. Mira, the Salar de Uyuni is a truly breathtaking sight. And in Niger, the country's natural environment is also home to a variety of unique landscapes, including the Air Mountains and the Niger River.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the unique landscapes of Niger and Bolivia. Do you think these countries are doing enough to protect their natural environments?
That's a great question. Mira, and speaking of natural environments, Bolivia and Niger both have a strong commitment to sustainable tourism. The country's tourism boards are working hard to promote eco-friendly tourism and support local communities.
Yes. Bolivia's sustainable tourism initiatives are truly inspiring, and I'm sure our listeners would agree. In Niger, the country's tourism industry is also growing, particularly in the city of Niamey, where visitors can experience the country's vibrant culture and rich history.
That's right. Mira, and both Bolivia and Niger have a strong tradition of community engagement and social responsibility. The country's residents are passionate about giving back to their communities and preserving their cultural heritage.
I completely agree. Leo, in Bolivia, we also have a strong tradition of community engagement and social responsibility, particularly in the indigenous communities of the highlands. The country's residents are committed to preserving their cultural heritage and passing it down to future generations.
Absolutely. Mira, And speaking of community engagement, Niger has a unique tradition of community-based tourism. The country's residents are working hard to promote tourism and support local communities, while also preserving their cultural heritage.
Ah, yes. Bolivia's community-based tourism initiatives are also truly inspiring, and I'm sure our listeners would agree. The country's residents are passionate about giving back to their communities and preserving their cultural heritage.
That's right. Mira. And both Bolivia and Niger have a strong connection to their histories and traditions. The country's residents are proud of their cultural heritage and work hard to preserve it for future generations.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that Bolivia and Niger are two countries with a rich cultural heritage and a deep connection to their traditions. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unique aspects of these two fascinating countries.
And thank you, Mira, for sharing your insights and passion for Bolivia and Niger. It's been a pleasure to explore these two countries with you, and we hope our listeners have enjoyed this journey as well.
Don't forget to follow the Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this, and hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments below, and we'll respond to them in our next episode.
And finally, thank you to our listeners for joining us on this comparison podcast. We hope you've enjoyed learning about Bolivia and Niger, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Until next time, adios, au revoir.
Warmest wishes from us to you, and we'll see you in the next one.